Close your eyes and imagine standing on the shores of the Mediterranean Sea, 3,200 years ago. The year is 1177 BCE, and the world as humanity knows it is about to end. Not with a bang, not with a single catastrophic event, but with a whisper, a cough, a fever that spreads through the greatest civilizations ever built. Tonight, we're going down a rabbit hole so deep, so unsettling, that by the time we reach the bottom, you'll understand why historians call this period the greatest mystery of the ancient world. Before we begin this journey into darkness, do me a solid and hit that subscribe button. Trust me, you're gonna want to stick around for more stories like this one, because what you're about to hear will blow your mind in ways you never expected. And hey, drop a comment below telling me what keeps you up at night, because I got plenty more where this came from. Now, let's drift back in time, shall we? The Mediterranean world of the late Bronze Age wasn't just advanced. It was mind-blowingly sophisticated in ways that would make even our modern world jealous. Picture this: sprawling palace complexes that would put modern architecture to shame, international trade networks that span thousands of miles, diplomatic correspondence between kings written on clay tablets, and a level of cultural exchange that rivals anything we see today. The Egyptians, the Hittites, the Mycenaeans, the Cypriots, the Canaanites, these weren't isolated civilizations playing in their own sandboxes. They were interconnected, interdependent, trading everything from tin and copper to olive oil and wine, from one end of the known world to the other. Let me paint you a picture of just how awesome things were before it all went sideways. In Egypt, Ramesses II. Yeah, that Ramesses, the one they call Ramesses the Great, ruled over a kingdom so wealthy, so powerful, that his monuments still make us gasp in wonder today. The temples at Abu Simbel, the Ramesseum, the additions to Karnak. This dude was building on a scale that screamed, "I'm the most powerful man alive and I want everyone to know it." Egyptian scribes kept meticulous records of everything: grain harvests, tax collections, diplomatic gifts, military campaigns. They knew exactly how many bushels of wheat were stored in every granary from Memphis to Thebes. They tracked the Nile's flood levels like we track stock markets. This wasn't some primitive society stumbling around in the dark. This was a well-oiled machine, a bureaucratic masterpiece that had been perfecting itself for nearly 2,000 years. Up north, in what's now Turkey, the Hittite Empire controlled Anatolia with an iron fist. Well, actually a bronze fist, but you get the idea. Their capital, Hattusa, was a fortress city carved into the mountains, with walls so thick and gates so massive that enemies took one look and decided to try their luck elsewhere. The Hittites had something nobody else had: they'd figured out how to work iron. Yeah, they were sitting on the next big technological revolution, and they knew it. But they kept that secret locked down tighter than Fort Knox, because in a world where bronze was king, whoever controlled iron would rule the future. The Hittite kings weren't just warriors, though. They were diplomats, administrators, keepers of vast archives filled with treaties, laws, religious texts, and correspondence with other rulers. When the Hittite king Hattusili III married off his daughter to Ramesses II, it wasn't just a wedding. It was a merger of two superpowers, an alliance that was supposed to bring peace and prosperity to the entire region. The tablet describing this marriage is literally one of the most important diplomatic documents in human history, and it shows just how sophisticated these Bronze Age civilizations really were. Now swing over to mainland Greece, where the Mycenaeans were living their best lives in palace complexes that would become the stuff of legend. Mycenae, Pylos, Tiryns, these weren't just cities, they were cultural powerhouses. The Mycenaeans were trading with everyone, sailing their ships across the Mediterranean like they owned the place. They were writing in Linear B, keeping records that show an economy so complex it would make your head spin. Every jar of oil, every piece of bronze, every sheep in the kingdom, all of it tracked, recorded, taxed. These palaces were buzzing with activity. Scribes sat in small rooms, stylus in hand, pressing symbols into wet clay. Craftsmen worked in specialized workshops, creating everything from intricate jewelry to weapons of war. Women wove textiles on looms, producing fabrics so fine they were exported across the known world. The storerooms were packed with enormous jars of olive oil, wine, grain, enough food to feed armies, enough wealth to fund expeditions to distant lands. And the Mycenaeans? They loved their bling. Gold death masks, intricate daggers inlaid with scenes of hunts and battles, cups made from precious metals. When Heinrich Schliemann dug up Mycenae in the 1870s, he literally thought he'd found the treasure of Agamemnon. That's how rich these people were. That's how powerful. They were the heroes who would inspire Homer's epics, the warriors who supposedly sailed to Troy and burned it to the ground. But here's where things get interesting, and I mean really interesting. All of this prosperity, all of this sophistication, all of this power, it was balanced on a knife's edge. The Bronze Age Mediterranean was like a house of cards, and nobody realized how fragile it all was until it started coming down. See, bronze isn't just one metal. It's an alloy, a mixture of copper and tin, and here's the kicker. Copper was relatively common, but tin? Tin was rare as hell. The major tin sources were way out in Afghanistan, maybe in Cornwall in distant Britain, and getting that tin to the Mediterranean meant trade routes that stretched across continents. If anything happened to disrupt those routes, war, piracy, political upheaval, the whole system started to break down. Without tin, you couldn't make bronze. Without bronze, you couldn't make tools, weapons, or basically anything that required metal. The entire civilization ran on bronze, and the supply chain was fragile. But that wasn't the only vulnerability. The palace economies of the Bronze Age were highly centralized. Everything flowed to and from the palaces. The king's scribes controlled everything, allocated everything, redistributed everything. It was efficient, sure, but it meant that if something happened to the palace, if the central authority collapsed, the entire economic system went down with it. Still, in 1200 BCE, nobody was worried about that. The world had been running smoothly for generations. Trade was booming, cities were growing, art and literature were flourishing. The rulers of the great kingdoms exchanged gifts and letters, calling each other brother, negotiating marriages and alliances. Peace treaties were signed and sealed. Everything was awesome. And then, something changed. It started subtly, so subtly that at first nobody really noticed. A village here, a coastal settlement there, going quiet. Letters that should have arrived, didn't. Ships that were expected to dock in port, never showed up. Small disturbances, easy to dismiss as local problems, pirates maybe, or bandits. Nothing to worry about. Nothing that would threaten the great kingdoms. But the problems kept spreading. In the archaeological record, we can see it happening. Destruction layers appear in site after site, moving roughly from north to south, from east to west, like a wave of chaos washing across the Mediterranean world. Cities that had stood for centuries were suddenly abandoned or burned. Palace archives stop abruptly, mid-sentence sometimes, as if the scribes just put down their styluses and walked away, never to return. Historians and archaeologists have been arguing for decades about what caused the Bronze Age collapse. Was it invasion? Earthquake? Climate change? Economic failure? And here's the thing, they're all probably right, because what brought down the Bronze Age world wasn't one single thing. It was a perfect storm of disasters, all hitting at once, each one making the others worse. But there's one factor that doesn't get talked about enough, one piece of the puzzle that might actually tie everything else together. Disease, plague, pestilence. The invisible killer that moves through populations faster than any army, that respects no borders and no walls, that can bring down the mighty and the weak with equal efficiency. Let me take you back to Egypt, to the reign of Ramesses V. This pharaoh died young, unexpectedly, around 1145 BCE. When his mummy was examined in modern times, scientists found something shocking. The pustules, the lesions, the unmistakable signs of smallpox. This is the earliest confirmed case of smallpox in human history, preserved for over 3,000 years in the dry Egyptian desert. But here's what keeps me up at night. If Ramesses V had smallpox, where did he get it? And more importantly, who else had it? Diseases don't just appear out of nowhere. They spread. They move through populations. They travel along the same trade routes that carried copper and tin, olive oil and wine. Imagine you're a merchant in 1180 BCE. You've just concluded a successful trading mission in the Levant, your ship is loaded with valuable cargo, and you're heading back to your home port in Cyprus. But one of your crew members is feeling a bit off. Maybe he's got a fever, maybe he's coughing. No big deal, right? Sailors get sick all the time. But by the time you reach Cyprus, half your crew is sick. By the time you unload your cargo, people in the port are falling ill. And because Cyprus is a major trading hub, those sick people interact with merchants from Crete, from Mycenaean Greece, from Anatolia, from Egypt. Within weeks, the disease is in a dozen cities. Within months, it's everywhere. And unlike an invading army, you can't see it coming. You can't build walls against it. You can't negotiate with it. It just spreads, silently, invisibly, leaving death and chaos in its wake. Now, I know what you're thinking. Okay, so there might have been a plague, but that can't explain everything. What about all the other evidence? What about the destruction layers, the burned cities, the mysterious sea peoples who supposedly invaded from the north? Hang tight, because this is where the story gets really wild. Remember to smash that like button if you're still with me, because we're about to go deep down this particular rabbit hole, and trust me, you won't want to miss what comes next. The Sea Peoples. These guys are like the boogeyman of Bronze Age archaeology. Egyptian texts describe them as invaders from the islands in the midst of the sea, mysterious foreigners who came in waves, destroying everything in their path. Ramesses III, who ruled Egypt in the early 12th century BCE, left us detailed descriptions of his battles against these mysterious invaders. He had scenes carved on the walls of his mortuary temple at Medinet Habu, showing naval battles and land conflicts with these foreign enemies. But here's the million-dollar question. Who were the Sea Peoples, and where did they come from? The Egyptian texts give us names: the Peleset, the Checker, the Shikalesh, the Denyen, the Weshish. These names might sound like gibberish, but scholars have spent over a century trying to match them up with known peoples. The Peleset might be the Philistines, who settled in Canaan. The Denyen might be related to the Danans, a name Homer used for Greeks. The Shikalesh might be from Sicily. But even if we can figure out who they were, that doesn't tell us why they were on the move. See, calling them invaders might be missing the point. What if they weren't invaders at all? What if they were refugees? Picture this scenario. Plague breaks out in the Aegean, in the Mycenaean kingdoms of Greece. Villages are decimated. Crops rot in the fields because there's nobody left to harvest them. The centralized palace economies start to break down because the administrators, the scribes, the craftsmen, they're sick or dead or fleeing. Food shortages lead to social unrest. Social unrest leads to violence. And suddenly, you've got thousands of people with no food, no homes, no future, and only one option: move or die. So they move. They pack up whatever they can carry, they get on ships or form into groups, and they head south, looking for anywhere that might take them in, anywhere that might still have food, anywhere they might survive. They're not an organized invading force. They're desperate refugees, and desperate people do desperate things. When these groups reach the prosperous cities of the Levant and try to settle there, the locals aren't exactly welcoming. Why would they be? They've got their own problems. The plague is probably hitting them too by now. They can't feed their own people, let alone thousands of refugees. So violence breaks out. Cities get burned, not by organized armies, but by starving refugees fighting with defending locals, and both sides losing because the real enemy isn't each other. It's the invisible plague that's killing everyone regardless of which side they're on. Meanwhile, the trade networks that held the Bronze Age world together are falling apart. Ships stop sailing because the merchants are dead or the ports are abandoned. Tin stops flowing from Afghanistan because the overland routes are too dangerous or the middlemen are gone. Without tin, bronze production crashes. Without bronze, you can't maintain armies, you can't make farm tools, you can't repair critical infrastructure. And here's where the centralized palace economies become a fatal weakness. In a decentralized system, if one area fails, others can adapt and survive. But in the Bronze Age system, everything depended on the palaces. When the palaces fell, whether to plague or refugee attacks, or simply because they couldn't function anymore without the complex administrative apparatus that kept them running, everything else collapsed too. The scribes stopped writing because there was nobody to pay them, or no palace to write for, or maybe they were dead. The craftsmen stopped producing because there were no raw materials, or no customers, or maybe they were dead too. The farmers stopped bringing surplus to the palaces because the palace couldn't protect them anymore, or redistribute food during bad harvests, or maybe the farmers were also dead. Within a generation, maybe two, the entire Bronze Age Mediterranean world just stopped. Cities were abandoned. Palaces burned or fell into ruins. The writing systems were forgotten. Linear B just disappeared, as if it had never existed. Trade routes that had functioned for centuries went silent. The population crashed by as much as 75% in some regions. It was an apocalypse, a true end of the world as they knew it. But the craziest part? 4 centuries afterward, the people who lived in the ruins of this civilization had no idea what they'd lost. The Greeks of the Archaic period, hundreds of years later, looked at the massive stone walls of Mycenae and Tiryns and assumed they must have been built by giants, by cyclopes, the one-eyed monsters of legend. They couldn't imagine that humans had built such things. They'd forgotten how. The Dark Age that followed the Bronze Age collapse lasted for about 300 years. 3 centuries of reduced population, minimal trade, lost technologies, forgotten writing. It was like someone hit the reset button on civilization in the Mediterranean world. Let me take you through what this actually looked like on the ground, in the places where people lived and died. Start in Mycenaean Greece. The palace at Pylos, in the southwestern Peloponnese, was one of the great centers of Mycenaean power. The palace complex was huge, with hundreds of rooms, massive storage areas, advanced plumbing, beautiful frescoes on the walls. The archives at Pylos give us an incredibly detailed picture of life in the late Bronze Age. We know how many sheep the palace controlled, over 25,000 of them. We know the names of individual shepherds. We know what kinds of offerings were made to which gods. We know that the palace employed bronzesmiths, perfume makers, textile workers, and dozens of other specialists. And then, sometime around 1180 BCE, it all ended. The palace at Pylos burned. Not just burned, it was absolutely destroyed, reduced to rubble so thoroughly that it was never rebuilt. The Linear B tablets survived only because the fire that destroyed the building baked them hard, preserving them by accident. But here's the weird thing. There's no evidence of a big battle. No mass grave of defenders. No weapons scattered around. It's almost like the palace was just abandoned and then burned. Maybe by looters, maybe by the few remaining inhabitants trying to destroy what they couldn't take with them, maybe by accident. We don't know. The other Mycenaean palaces, Mycenae, Tiryns, Thebes, they met similar fates around the same time. Some show evidence of violence. Others just seem to have been abandoned. In some places, you can see attempts to rebuild or reinforce defenses in the final years, like the inhabitants knew something bad was coming and were desperately trying to prepare. They built new walls, blocked up old gates, stored extra weapons and food. But it didn't help. After the palaces fell, the population of Greece crashed. Archaeological surveys show that the number of inhabited sites drops by something like 75 to 90%. Entire regions that had been densely populated became almost empty. The survivors lived in small villages, often in remote, defensible locations. They stopped building in stone. They didn't have the organization or resources for that anymore. They lived in mud brick huts that have left almost no archaeological trace. Trade stopped. Pottery styles became local and simple. None of the fine, decorated wares that had been traded across the Mediterranean. Writing disappeared completely. Nobody in Greece would write anything down again for about 400 years, until they adopted the Phoenician alphabet and modified it to create Greek alphabets. Now swing over to Anatolia, to the Hittite Empire. The Hittites had been one of the great superpowers of the late Bronze Age. They'd fought the Egyptians to a standstill at the Battle of Kadesh. They'd signed treaties with the Assyrians and Babylonians. Their capital, Hattusa, was one of the most impressive cities in the ancient world, with temples, palaces, and archives filled with thousands of tablets. Around 1190 BCE, Hattusa was abandoned. Not destroyed in some catastrophic battle. Just abandoned. The inhabitants packed up and left, and the city was never reoccupied. The Hittite Empire, which had controlled all of Anatolia, just ceased to exist. The administrative apparatus fell apart. The king disappeared from the historical record. The empire fragmented into small kingdoms and city-states that bore little resemblance to the great power that had existed before. The Hittite archives stop abruptly, and the last texts we have show a kingdom in crisis. There are letters about grain shortages, urgent requests for food shipments. There are texts that mention enemies attacking from multiple directions. There are references to plague, to sickness spreading through the population. And then, silence. Some Hittite centers survived for a while in southeastern Anatolia and northern Syria, but they were just remnants, shadows of the former empire. The iron-working technology that the Hittites had jealously guarded? With the empire gone, that knowledge spread. The Iron Age was beginning, but it was beginning in the ruins of the Bronze Age world. Cyprus, the island that had been one of the wealthiest trading hubs in the Mediterranean, suffered wave after wave of destruction. Cities were burned, rebuilt, and burned again. The copper industry, which had made Cyprus rich, collapsed. The island's population crashed. Some coastal settlements were abandoned entirely, with survivors moving to more defensible positions inland. The Levant, the coastal regions of modern-day Lebanon, Syria, and Israel/Palestine, saw similar devastation. Ugarit, one of the most important port cities in the ancient world, was destroyed around 1190 BCE and never rebuilt. The destruction was so complete that the site wasn't even reoccupied in later periods. It just stayed abandoned until archaeologists started digging it up in the 1920s. And the wild thing about Ugarit is that we have letters from right before the end. There's a letter from the king of Ugarit to the king of Alashia, probably Cyprus, that's just heartbreaking in its desperation. The king is basically saying, "Dude, where are you? Enemy ships have been sighted off our coast, our troops are stuck in Anatolia, and we're defenseless here. Please send help." There's another letter that mentions 7 enemy ships appearing off the coast and causing massive damage. But help never came. Ugarit burned. The palace was destroyed. The rich merchants' houses were looted and torched. The temples fell. And the city was never rebuilt. Other Levantine cities, Megiddo, Hazor, Lachish, suffered similar fates. Multiple destruction layers in the archaeological record show these cities being destroyed, partially rebuilt, and destroyed again over the course of a few decades. It was chaos, pure and simple. Egypt, the most stable and powerful of all the Bronze Age kingdoms, managed to survive, but just barely. Ramesses III fought off the Sea Peoples in a series of battles around 1177 BCE. He recorded his victories in great detail, showing us naval battles and land conflicts. But victory came at a terrible cost. Egypt's empire in the Levant was lost. The trade routes were cut. The economy was in shambles. After Ramesses III, Egypt entered a period of decline. The New Kingdom, that glorious age of military expansion and monumental building, was effectively over. Egypt would survive as a kingdom for centuries more, but it would never again reach the heights of power it had achieved under the Ramesses dynasty. And here's something that's often overlooked. Even in Egypt, even in the texts that celebrate Ramesses III's victories over the Sea Peoples, there are hints of plague. There are references to sickness, to disease spreading through the army and the civilian population. The Egyptians attributed it to divine displeasure, of course. That's how people understood disease in the ancient world. But the descriptions match what we'd expect from an epidemic. So let me pull this all together for you, because I know I've been throwing a lot at you, and you're probably lying there in the dark wondering how all these pieces fit. The Bronze Age collapse wasn't caused by one thing. It was a cascade of disasters, each one making the others worse. Plague, possibly smallpox, possibly other diseases, we may never know for sure, spread along the trade routes, killing millions and disrupting the economies and administrations of every major kingdom. Climate change, in the form of drought and crop failures, made food scarce and drove populations to desperation. Earthquakes struck at the worst possible time, destroying cities that were already weakened by plague and famine. And massive population movements, refugees fleeing from regions that could no longer support them, created conflict and chaos wherever they went. Any one of these factors might have been survivable. The Bronze Age kingdoms were sophisticated and resilient. They'd weathered crises before. But all of these disasters happening at once, in a world where everything was interconnected, that was too much. The system couldn't handle it. The trade networks failed, cutting off the supply of tin and copper needed to make bronze. The centralized palace economies collapsed, unable to function without the complex administrative apparatus that kept them running. Writing systems were forgotten because there was nobody left to teach them and no institutions to support scribes. Technologies were lost because the master craftsmen died before they could pass on their knowledge. Cities were abandoned because they couldn't be defended or supplied. And in the span of just 2 or 3 generations, the most advanced civilization the world had ever seen simply ceased to exist. But you know what the really terrifying part is? We could be just as vulnerable today. Think about it. Our world is even more interconnected than the Bronze Age Mediterranean. We depend on global supply chains for everything: food, medicine, technology, raw materials. If those supply chains were disrupted, if some combination of plague, climate change, and conflict hit us all at once, how would we fare? Would our just-in-time delivery systems hold up? Would our governments maintain order? Or would we see the same kind of cascading collapse that destroyed the Bronze Age world? It's a sobering thought, isn't it? But let's get back to the ancient world, because I haven't told you the most fascinating part of this story yet. The end of the Bronze Age wasn't the end of civilization in the Mediterranean. It was a transition, a painful and catastrophic transition, but one that ultimately led to something new. Out of the ashes of the Bronze Age world, new civilizations would emerge. The Phoenicians, descendants of the Canaanites who survived the collapse, would become the great traders and colonizers of the Mediterranean, spreading their alphabet, the ancestor of the one you're reading right now, across the ancient world. The Greeks would eventually recover from their dark age and create the classical civilization we all learn about in school, with its philosophy, art, literature, and democracy. The Israelites would emerge in the hill country of Canaan and develop the religious traditions that would become Judaism, Christianity, and indirectly influence Islam. The Iron Age would bring new technologies, new forms of political organization, new ways of thinking about the world. In some ways, the collapse of the old order created space for innovations that might not have been possible in the rigid, hierarchical world of the Bronze Age palaces. But the transition was brutal. Millions died. Centuries of accumulated knowledge were lost. The survivors had to rebuild almost from scratch, and it took them generations to create something even approaching the sophistication of what had been lost. In the abandoned ruins of Mycenaean palaces, in the empty halls of Hattusa, in the burned remains of Ugarit, we can see the price of collapse. And in the meticulous records kept by Bronze Age scribes, we can glimpse what was lost. Not just buildings and artifacts, but an entire way of life, a whole world of knowledge and culture that vanished in the span of a single lifetime. If you're still listening, if you haven't drifted off to sleep yet, I want you to do something for me. Hit that subscribe button, drop a comment telling me what you think happened to the Bronze Age world, and stick around because we've got a lot more ground to cover. This story is far from over. Let me take you deeper into the mystery, into the lives of the people who lived through this catastrophe and tried to make sense of what was happening to their world. Imagine you're a scribe at the palace of Pilus, in the final years before the collapse. Your father was a scribe, and his father before him. Your family has served the palace for generations, recording the minutiae of palace administration on clay tablets. You know exactly how many sheep are in the palace flocks, how much oil is stored in the magazines, which villages owe what taxes. You're part of an elite, a literate minority who keeps the whole system running smoothly. But lately, things have been off. There are rumors of trouble in the north, of cities burning, of refugees flooding southward. Trade ships that used to arrive regularly from Crete and Cyprus have stopped coming. The bronzesmiths are complaining about shortages of tin. Food supplies are lower than they should be, even though the harvest was decent. And people are getting sick. At first, it's just a few cases here and there. A fever, a rash, some people recover, but others don't. Then more people fall ill. The palace physician, who's more of a priest-healer than what we'd recognize as a doctor, tries the usual remedies. Prayers to the gods, offerings at the temples, herbal treatments. Nothing seems to help. You keep working because that's what you do. You record the offerings made to Poseidon, the patron god of Pylus. You note the distributions of rations to palace workers. You track the conscription of rowers for the fleet. The palace is building up its naval forces, preparing for some threat from the sea. But there are fewer people to conscript than there should be. Villages that used to provide dozens of men can barely scrape together a handful. One day, you notice that fewer scribes are showing up for work. Some are sick. Others have fled, taking their families to relatives in the countryside, hoping to escape whatever disaster they sense is coming. The head scribe issues orders to build up the palace defenses, to stockpile food and weapons. You write down these orders dutifully, pressing your stylus into the soft clay. And then one day, it all ends. Maybe there's an attack, desperate refugees trying to seize the palace's stored food. Maybe the defenders are too few and too weak from sickness to hold them off. Maybe the survivors just decide it's not worth trying to defend anymore, and they abandon the palace, scattering into the countryside. You grab what you can carry and flee. The tablets you were working on, the careful records of sheep and oil and bronze, are left behind in the archive room. When the palace burns, those tablets will be baked hard, preserving your last entries for archaeologists to find 3,000 years later. But you don't know that. You just know that the world you understood, the orderly world of palace administration and international trade and specialized craftsmen, is falling apart around you. You don't understand why. How could you? You don't know about systemic collapse or cascading failures or the fragility of interconnected systems. You just know that everything is going wrong, and nobody seems to be able to stop it. Maybe you make it to safety, to some remote village in the mountains where you live out the rest of your days as a farmer. Your children never learn to read or write. There's no one to teach them, and no use for literacy in the new world anyway. The skills that made you special, that gave you status, die with you. And within a generation or two, nobody in Greece can read at all. Or maybe you don't make it. Maybe you're one of the millions who died during the collapse, from disease or starvation or violence. Your name is lost, your story forgotten. You become just another anonymous victim of one of the greatest catastrophes in human history. Now multiply that story by millions. Because for every scribe, every craftsman, every merchant whose world fell apart, there were countless farmers, shepherds, laborers, women, and children whose lives were upended. People who just wanted to live in peace, raise their families, grow their crops, worship their gods. People who didn't care about international politics or trade networks or palace administration. They just wanted to survive. And for most of them, survival meant fleeing, fighting, or dying. The human cost of the Bronze Age collapse is almost impossible to comprehend. We're talking about a population decline of 50 to 75% or more in many regions. That's tens of millions of deaths over the course of a few generations. To put that in perspective, the Black Death in medieval Europe killed maybe a third of the population, and that was considered one of the worst catastrophes in European history. The Bronze Age collapse was twice as deadly, or even worse in some areas. And unlike a plague that runs its course and then recedes, the Bronze Age collapse just kept going. The immediate deaths from disease were followed by famines as agricultural systems broke down. The famines were followed by violence as desperate groups fought over dwindling resources. The violence was followed by further economic collapse as trade networks failed and specialized craftsmen died or fled. It was a downward spiral that lasted for decades, and by the time it was over, the world was fundamentally different. The survivors of this catastrophe had to adapt to a much harsher reality. The palace economies that had provided stability and redistributed resources were gone. You couldn't rely on the king's granaries to feed you during a bad harvest anymore. You couldn't expect the palace craftsmen to make the tools you needed. You were on your own. So people adapted. They moved to more defensible locations, hilltops, islands, places that could be protected with minimal manpower. They abandoned the sprawling cities of the Bronze Age and lived in small, tight-knit communities where everyone knew everyone else and strangers were viewed with suspicion. They simplified their technology, making do with less. They forgot how to write because writing was a specialized skill that required training and served no purpose in a world without bureaucracy. They told stories, though. Oh, they told stories. The Greeks of the Dark Age, huddled around fires on long winter nights, told tales of the glorious age that had come before. They talked about Mycenae rich in gold, about Agamemnon who commanded 1,000 ships, about heroes and battles and cities besieged. They remembered Troy. Or at least, they remembered that there had been a great war, a great expedition across the sea to a rich city that was besieged and eventually fell. Were these stories accurate history? Not really. They were a mixture of vague memories, folklore, and imagination. But they preserved something important: the knowledge that things had once been different, that their ancestors had achieved great things, that the massive stone walls they could see crumbling on the hilltops had been built by men, not giants. And centuries later, when writing returned to Greece and a poet named Homer, or maybe several poets whose work was combined under that name, composed the Iliad and the Odyssey, those old stories became literature. They became the foundation of Greek culture, the texts that every educated Greek knew by heart. But Homer's world was nothing like the Bronze Age world he was describing. He got all sorts of details wrong because he was writing about a civilization that had been gone for 400 years. He describes warriors using iron weapons when Bronze Age warriors would have used bronze. He describes political systems that didn't exist in the Bronze Age. He's anachronistic as hell. But embedded in those epics are genuine memories of the Bronze Age world. The great palaces, the international connections, the wealth and power of the Mycenaean kingdoms. The Iliad is set during the Trojan War, which, if it happened at all, probably took place right around the time of the Bronze Age collapse. And you know what's interesting? The Iliad is, in many ways, a story about the end of an age. The heroes die, the city falls, and in the Odyssey, we see Odysseus returning to a world that's falling apart. Ithaca is overrun with unruly suitors who are devouring his wealth. His household is in chaos. He has to fight to reclaim what's his. It's almost like the cultural memory of the collapse was so strong that it shaped how the Greeks thought about heroism and tragedy. The Bronze Age heroes were magnificent, but doomed. They achieved glory, but they couldn't prevent the end of their world. And maybe that's the real lesson of the Bronze Age collapse. Not that civilizations are fragile, though they are. Not that we should fear collapse, though maybe we should be more aware of the warning signs. But that human beings are resilient. We survive. We adapt. We rebuild. The people who lived through the Bronze Age collapse lost almost everything. They lost their cities, their culture, their technology, their literacy. They watched the greatest civilizations in the world crumble into dust. And yet, they endured. They raised families in the ruins. They told stories to their children about the world that had been. They planted crops and tended animals and slowly, painfully, built something new. It took centuries, but eventually, new civilizations arose. The Phoenicians built a maritime empire on trade, spreading their alphabet to the far corners of the Mediterranean. The Greeks created a culture of inquiry and debate that would influence Western thought for millennia. The Israelites developed ethical monotheism and wrote texts that would become sacred scriptures for billions of people. The Assyrians, the Babylonians, the Persians, all of them would build great empires in the centuries following the collapse. The Iron Age world that emerged from the ruins of the Bronze Age was different in fundamental ways. Iron was more common than bronze, which meant weapons and tools could be produced more widely, democratizing military power. Alphabetic writing was simpler than the syllabic scripts of the Bronze Age, making literacy more accessible. Political systems evolved to be less centralized, less dependent on palace economies. In some ways, the collapse created opportunities for innovation that might not have existed in the rigid world of Bronze Age palace bureaucracies. New ideas could flourish because the old authorities were gone. New peoples could rise to prominence because the old powers had fallen. But make no mistake, the transition was catastrophic for the people who lived through it. The fact that good things eventually emerged from the ruins doesn't make the suffering and death and loss any less tragic. Millions of people died. Centuries of accumulated knowledge were lost. Entire civilizations vanished. And the survivors had to live with the memory of what had been lost, the knowledge that their ancestors had achieved things they could no longer even imagine. Let's talk about what this all looked like in specific places, because the collapse didn't affect everywhere equally. Some regions suffered more than others. Some managed to adapt better. Some simply ceased to exist as coherent cultural entities. Take Cyprus, for example. This island had been insanely prosperous during the late Bronze Age. It was the primary source of copper in the eastern Mediterranean. And remember, copper is one of the two essential ingredients for bronze. The copper mines of Cyprus had made the island rich beyond measure. Cypriot merchants traded with everyone, from Egypt to Anatolia to the Aegean. The cities of Cyprus were sophisticated, cosmopolitan places where you might hear half a dozen languages spoken in the market. And then the collapse hit. Cyprus got slammed hard. Multiple waves of destruction swept across the island over the course of several decades. Cities burned, were rebuilt, and burned again. The archaeological record shows this happening over and over. Destruction layer, rebuilding, destruction layer, rebuilding, destruction layer, abandonment. What's particularly interesting about Cyprus is that we can see evidence of refugees arriving on the island and settling there. New pottery styles appear, new burial customs, new architectural techniques, all suggesting that people from the Aegean, from Anatolia, maybe from other places, were fleeing to Cyprus and trying to start over. Sometimes they integrated with the locals. Sometimes there was conflict. The situation was fluid, chaotic, constantly changing. The copper industry collapsed. Not immediately, but over time, as the trade networks that had made Cypriot copper valuable broke down. Without international trade, who was going to buy copper in massive quantities? The palace economies that had been the major customers were gone. The result was economic catastrophe on the island. The population crashed, cities were abandoned, and Cyprus entered its own dark age that lasted for generations. But Cyprus survived. Unlike some places that were completely abandoned, Cyprus maintained some level of continuity. People kept living there, kept working copper on a smaller scale, kept telling stories about the glorious past. And eventually, in the Iron Age, Cyprus would recover and become prosperous again, though in a very different world. Now look at the Levantine coast. This region had been a patchwork of city-states and small kingdoms, some under Egyptian influence, others independent or allied with the Hittites. Cities like Ugarit, Sidon, Tyre, and Byblos had been major players in Mediterranean trade. Ugarit, as I mentioned earlier, was utterly destroyed around 1190 BCE. The city was so thoroughly wrecked that it was never reoccupied. Even in later periods, when the coast was repopulated, nobody bothered to rebuild on the site of Ugarit. It just stayed abandoned, a ghost city, until French archaeologists started excavating it in the 1920s. But you know what they found when they excavated Ugarit? The archives. And those archives are absolutely fascinating because they give us a snapshot of a civilization in its final moments. There are letters about food shortages, requests for military aid, panicked messages about enemy ships off the coast. There are administrative texts that just stop mid-year, as if the scribes put down their styluses and never came back. One of the most haunting texts from Ugarit is a letter that was found in a kiln, still waiting to be baked hard. It was never sent. The city fell before the letter could be dispatched. We don't know what it said, but we know it was important enough to write. And we know the person who wrote it never got to send it because they were probably dead or fleeing for their life within days of writing it. Other Levantine cities survived longer than Ugarit, but they all suffered. Sidon and Tyre made it through, barely, and would go on to become the major Phoenician cities in the Iron Age. But even they went through periods of destruction and abandonment. The coast was in chaos for decades. And then there are the Philistines. Remember the Peleset, one of the groups that made up the Sea Peoples? They ended up settling in the southern Levantine coast, in cities like Ashkelon, Ashdod, and Gaza. The archaeological record shows a distinctive new culture appearing in this region right after the Bronze Age collapse. Pottery styles that seem to come from the Aegean, architectural techniques that are different from local traditions, burial customs that are foreign. These were probably refugees from the Mycenaean world, or maybe from Cyprus, or maybe a mix of different groups who banded together and created a new identity. The Bible calls them Philistines, and they would become the perennial enemies of the Israelites in the biblical narratives. But the Philistines were just survivors, like everyone else, trying to make a new life in a world that had been turned upside down. The Israelites themselves, and I need to tread carefully here because this gets into religious tradition and national identity and all sorts of sensitive stuff. But the scholarly consensus is that the Israelites emerged in the hill country of Canaan during or shortly after the Bronze Age collapse. The cities of the coastal plain were in chaos, trade had broken down, the Egyptian empire had retreated from the Levant. In this power vacuum, new groups formed in the highlands, creating settlements that would eventually coalesce into the kingdoms of Israel and Judah. The biblical narratives about the Exodus and the conquest of Canaan probably preserve some kind of cultural memory from this period, but they've been shaped and reshaped by centuries of retelling. What we can say is that the Bronze Age collapse created the conditions that allowed the Israelites to emerge as a distinct group. If the great powers of the Bronze Age had still been around, controlling the region tightly, the history of monotheism might have been very different. Let me shift gears and talk about Egypt for a bit, because Egypt's experience of the collapse was unique. Egypt was the most stable, the most powerful, the most resilient of all the Bronze Age civilizations. It had weathered crises before: civil wars, foreign invasions, famines, plagues. The Egyptian state had been around, in one form or another, for well over 1,000 years by the time the Bronze Age collapse hit. The bureaucracy was ancient and experienced. The priesthood was rich and politically powerful. The pharaohs claimed to be living gods. Surely if any Bronze Age civilization could survive the collapse intact, it would be Egypt, right? Well, yes and no. Egypt did survive. The Egyptian state didn't completely collapse like the Hittite Empire did. There was continuity of government, continuity of culture, continuity of religion. Egyptian hieroglyphics didn't disappear the way Linear B did. The temples kept functioning. Pharaohs kept getting crowned and building monuments to themselves. But Egypt was badly hurt. Really badly hurt. The New Kingdom, that glorious age when Egypt had been a superpower with an empire stretching from Nubia to Syria, was effectively over. The last really powerful pharaoh was Ramesses III, and even his reign was marked by crisis after crisis. He fought off the Sea Peoples, but at enormous cost. The Egyptian empire in Asia was lost. All those territories in the Levant that Egypt had controlled for generations just slipped away. After Ramesses III, Egypt entered a long, slow decline. There were still pharaohs, but they were weaker, their authority more limited. The priesthood of Ammon-Ra at Thebes became increasingly powerful, sometimes rivaling the pharaohs themselves. Egypt fragmented politically, with different regions sometimes operating semi-independently. Foreign dynasties would eventually rule Egypt. First Libyans, then Nubians, then Assyrians, then Persians, and finally Greeks and Romans. Egypt in the Iron Age was still Egypt, still recognizably the same culture it had been in the Bronze Age. But it was never again the superpower it had been under the Ramesses dynasty. The Bronze Age collapse marked the end of Egypt's Golden Age, even if it didn't end Egypt itself. The Egyptian texts from the period right after the Bronze Age collapse make for depressing reading. There are accounts of tomb robberies, not ordinary grave robbing, but organized gangs of thieves stripping the tombs of pharaohs in the Valley of the Kings, melting down the gold, stealing the treasures. This was happening within generations of the pharaohs being buried. Think about what that says about social breakdown, about the loss of respect for authority and tradition. There are accounts of grain shortages, of workers at the royal tomb not being paid, of strikes and protests. There's a famous document called the Report of Weneman that describes an Egyptian envoy trying to buy timber from Byblos in Phoenicia. In the good old days, Egypt had been so powerful that foreign rulers would practically give them whatever they wanted. But in this text, the Prince of Byblos treats the Egyptian envoy with thinly veiled contempt, demanding payment up front, making him wait for months, basically treating Egypt like a has-been. It's a sad story, really. Egypt had been the most powerful, most prestigious civilization in the world for over a millennium. And now, in the space of a few generations, it had been reduced to begging for timber from a petty Phoenician prince who barely bothered to show respect. But Egypt endured. That's the thing about Egyptian civilization. It was incredibly conservative, incredibly resistant to change, incredibly good at preserving itself. Egyptian culture would continue for thousands of years more, through conquest after conquest, dynasty after dynasty, all the way down to the Roman period. The last hieroglyphic inscriptions weren't carved until the 4th century CE, over 3,000 years after the invention of writing in Egypt. So Egypt survived the Bronze Age collapse, but it was never the same again. The age of Egyptian dominance was over. Now, let's talk about something that doesn't get discussed enough: what the Bronze Age collapse tells us about our own world. Because here's the thing, the parallels are kind of terrifying. The Bronze Age Mediterranean was a globalized world, with complex trade networks, interdependent economies, and rapid exchange of ideas and technologies. Sound familiar? Our modern world is even more interconnected, even more dependent on global supply chains, even more specialized and complex. The Bronze Age world collapsed, at least in part, because it was too complex, too interconnected, too specialized. When the system started to break down, the failures cascaded through the entire network. Trade routes failed, which meant resources couldn't get to where they were needed, which meant craftsmen couldn't work, which meant less goods were produced, which meant less trade, which meant more routes failed. It was a vicious cycle, a death spiral. Could that happen to us? Could our modern civilization collapse the same way the Bronze Age world did? The honest answer is, maybe. We're vulnerable in ways the Bronze Age world never was. We depend on electricity, on the internet, on just-in-time supply chains that keep minimal inventory because storing goods is expensive. We've specialized to an insane degree. I bet most people reading this have no idea how to grow their own food, make their own clothes, build their own shelter. We depend on an incredibly complex system to provide all of that for us. If that system failed, if a combination of climate change, pandemic disease, resource depletion, and political instability hit us all at once, we might be in serious trouble. I'm not trying to be alarmist here. I'm not saying collapse is inevitable or even likely. But I am saying that the Bronze Age collapse is a warning from history. It's a reminder that even sophisticated civilizations can fall, and fall hard. It's a reminder that complexity and interconnection bring benefits, but also vulnerabilities. It's a reminder that we shouldn't take stability and prosperity for granted. The good news is that we have advantages the Bronze Age world didn't. We have scientific understanding of disease, so we can respond to pandemics more effectively than they could. We have global communication, so we can coordinate responses to crises. We have accumulated knowledge stored in countless ways: books, digital archives, distributed across the entire planet. So we're much less likely to lose critical information the way the Bronze Age world lost linear B. But we also have vulnerabilities they didn't. We have nuclear weapons, we have climate change, we have a global population in the billions that depends on industrial agriculture and global trade. If our system failed, the consequences could be even more catastrophic than the Bronze Age collapse. The point is, we should learn from history. We should understand that collapse is possible. We should build resilience into our systems, maintain redundancy, preserve knowledge, and not assume that complexity and growth can continue forever without consequences. And on that cheerful note, I think it's time to bring this story to a close. If you're still awake, and honestly if you are, I'm impressed because we've been at this for a while now, I want you to think about what you've learned. The Bronze Age collapse wasn't just an interesting historical event. It was a catastrophe that reshaped the entire Mediterranean world. It was the end of an age, the death of civilizations that had flourished for centuries. Millions of people died. Cities burned. Knowledge was lost. The survivors had to rebuild from almost nothing. But they did rebuild. They endured. They adapted. They created new civilizations, new ways of organizing society, new technologies, new ideas. The collapse was horrible, but it wasn't the end of human civilization in the Mediterranean. It was a transition, painful and bloody and catastrophic, but a transition nonetheless. The Phoenicians emerged from the ruins and became master sailors and traders. The Greeks created classical civilization. The Israelites developed monotheism. The Iron Age brought new technologies and new possibilities. The world that emerged from the Bronze Age collapse was different from what had come before, but it was vibrant and creative and full of life. And maybe that's the real takeaway from this whole story. Civilizations rise and fall. That's just how history works. But human beings endure. We're resilient, adaptable, creative. We survive catastrophes and we rebuild. We lose things, sometimes precious, irreplaceable things, but we also create new things, things that might not have been possible in the world that was lost. The Bronze Age scribes who carefully recorded every jar of oil and every sheep in the palace flocks, they're gone. Their world is gone. But we remember them. We dig up their tablets and read their words and marvel at their sophistication. They're not forgotten. The civilizations they served collapsed, but the knowledge that they existed, that they achieved great things, survives. And centuries from now, if our civilization has collapsed, maybe someone will dig up our remains and wonder about us. Maybe they'll find our books, our digital archives, our monuments. Maybe they'll tell stories about our achievements and our failures. Maybe they'll learn from our mistakes. Or maybe they won't. Maybe we'll be as mysterious to them as the Bronze Age world is to us. Maybe they'll look at our ruins and wonder what happened, why such an advanced civilization fell. But that's for the future to worry about. For now, we're still here. We're still building, creating, learning. We have the advantage of history, the knowledge of what came before. We can learn from the Bronze Age collapse. We can build societies that are resilient, that don't depend too heavily on complex, fragile systems, that preserve knowledge and maintain continuity even in times of crisis. Or we can ignore the lessons of history and hope that this time will be different. The choice is ours. Before you drift off to sleep, do me a favor. Hit that subscribe button if you haven't already. Drop a comment telling me what you think about the Bronze Age collapse, what lessons we should learn from it, what keeps you up at night. And check out my other videos, because there's a whole world of history out there waiting to be explored. The Bronze Age world is gone. The great palaces are ruins. The scribes are dust. The ships that once sailed the Mediterranean carrying copper and tin and oil and wine have long since rotted away. But the story survives. And as long as we remember, as long as we learn, as long as we tell the tales of what came before, those ancient civilizations aren't truly dead. They live on in us, in our memories, in the lessons we've learned from their rise and fall. Sleep well. Dream of ancient cities and bronze-clad warriors, of scribes carefully pressing styluses into clay, of ships sailing across azure seas. Dream of a world that was sophisticated and beautiful and complex, a world that fell but isn't forgotten. And when you wake up, remember, we're the inheritors of millennia of human history. Every civilization that's come before us, whether it thrived or failed, has taught us something. The Bronze Age collapse teaches us that nothing lasts forever, that even the greatest civilizations can fall, but also that human beings are resilient enough to survive even the worst catastrophes. We're still here. We're still telling stories. We're still building civilizations, still reaching for greatness, still trying to create something that will outlast us. Maybe we'll succeed. Maybe we'll fail. But either way, the story continues. Good night, and remember, history isn't just about the past. It's about understanding ourselves, understanding our world, understanding what's possible and what we should avoid. The Bronze Age collapse happened 3,000 years ago, but its lessons are eternal. Rest easy. The ancient world is gone, but we remain. And as long as we remember, as long as we learn, as long as we keep telling these stories, something of that ancient world survives in us. Sleep tight, and I'll catch you in the next one. There's always more history to explore, more stories to tell, more mysteries to unravel. Until next time, this has been Dreamless Timelines, reminding you that even in the darkest moments of history, even in the most catastrophic collapses, the human spirit endures. We survive. We adapt. We rebuild. And we never, ever stop telling stories. Now, let me take you somewhere you might not expect. Let's talk about the people whose names we'll never know, whose stories were never written down, who left almost no trace in the archaeological record, but who were, in many ways, the real heroes of this story. I'm talking about the ordinary people who survived the Bronze Age collapse and somehow managed to keep going. Picture a woman. Let's call her. Well, we don't know what her name was. The languages she spoke are dead. The records that might have mentioned her have turned to dust. But she was real. She lived somewhere in the Aegean, maybe on one of the islands, maybe on the mainland. This was around 1150 BCE, a generation or so after the great palaces had fallen. She would have been born into a world that was already falling apart. Her grandparents might have remembered the old days, when the palaces still stood, when trade ships came and went, when there were festivals and feasts and a sense that the world was stable and prosperous. But she never knew that world. All she knew was the reality of the collapse. Her village was small, maybe 20 or 30 families, clinging to existence on a rocky hillside. They'd chosen this location because it was defensible. You could see anyone approaching from miles away. That was important now. Strangers were dangerous. Raiders, refugees, desperate people willing to kill for food. You couldn't trust anyone outside your immediate community. She would have worked from dawn to dusk, every day, growing what little food they could coax from the thin soil, tending the goats and sheep that were their main source of protein, spinning wool, weaving cloth, because there were no more palace workshops producing textiles for redistribution. If your family needed clothes, you made them yourself. She would have known hunger. Real hunger, the kind where your stomach cramps and you feel weak and dizzy. The kind where you have to decide whether to eat now or save the food for your children. Harvests failed sometimes, drought, or storms, or pests, or just bad luck. And when harvests failed, people starved. There were no granaries to fall back on, no emergency relief, no palace officials redistributing stored grain. You ate what you grew, and if you didn't grow enough, you died. She would have known loss. Infant mortality was probably sky high. Disease, malnutrition, accidents. Children died all the time. Maybe she lost some of her own children. Maybe she watched siblings die, or parents, or friends. Death was a constant presence in her world, not something hidden away in hospitals and funeral homes like we do now, but right there in front of you, unavoidable. She would have known fear. Fear of raiders attacking in the night. Fear of running out of food. Fear of getting sick or injured, because there were no doctors, no medicine beyond whatever herbal remedies the village-wise woman knew. Fear of the sea, because sometimes ships came, and you never knew if they were traders or pirates or refugees who might turn violent if you didn't have food to share. But you know what else she would have known? Community. Because in a world that harsh, you couldn't survive alone. You needed your neighbors, your kin, your village. You helped each other plant and harvest. You shared tools, shared knowledge, shared food when you could. You protected each other. You raised each other's children when parents died. You told each other stories on long winter nights, preserving whatever fragments of the old culture you could remember. She would have told her children stories about the old days, stories her grandmother had told her, about the great palaces that used to stand on the hills, about the kings who lived there, about the scribes who could make marks on clay that spoke. Maybe she didn't really understand what those stories meant. The world they described was so different from her reality that it might as well have been fantasy. But she passed them on anyway, because that's what you did. You preserved what you could. And maybe her descendants, generations later, would still be telling those stories. And maybe, centuries in the future, a poet named Homer would weave those old stories into epic poems about heroes and gods and great wars. And maybe, millennia after that, people like you and me would read those poems and marvel at them, never knowing that they started with people like our nameless woman, keeping the memories alive through the darkest times. That's the human side of the Bronze Age collapse. Not just palaces burning and trade routes failing, but millions of individual people trying to survive, trying to raise their families, trying to maintain some shred of dignity and hope in a world that had turned unimaginably harsh. And they did survive. Not all of them. Probably most of them died, if we're being honest. But enough survived to pass on their genes, their stories, their knowledge. Enough survived that, within a few centuries, population levels started to recover. Villages started to grow. Trade started to pick up again. Writing was reinvented. Cities were rebuilt. The survivors of the Bronze Age collapse were the ancestors of classical Greece, of Phoenicia, of the Iron Age kingdoms that would shape the ancient world. Everything that came after, democracy, philosophy, alphabetic writing, ethical monotheism, all of it was built on the foundation laid by people who survived the collapse and refused to give up. That's pretty incredible when you think about it. These people had every reason to give up. They'd lost everything. The world they knew was gone. But they kept going anyway. They planted crops and raised children and told stories and slowly, painfully, built a new world from the ruins of the old. If that's not inspiring, I don't know what is. Let me shift gears again and talk about some of the specific archaeological sites that have taught us about the Bronze Age collapse. Because while we've been talking in broad terms about civilizations falling and trade routes failing, the real evidence comes from the ground, from the ruins that archaeologists have been excavating for the past century and a half. Take Mycenae itself, the city that gave its name to the entire civilization. Heinrich Schliemann, that crazy German businessman turned amateur archaeologist, started digging there in 1876. And boy, did he find some wild stuff. The famous gold death masks, including the one he thought belonged to Agamemnon. Spoiler alert, it didn't, it was way older than the Trojan War could have been. The royal shaft graves filled with weapons and jewelry and precious objects. The massive fortification walls that were so impressive, the later Greeks thought they must have been built by Cyclopes. But Schliemann was basically a treasure hunter, not a careful scientist. He dug through layers of archaeology like a kid digging for buried treasure, destroying tons of evidence in his rush to find gold. It wasn't until later archaeologists came in and did proper stratigraphic excavation that we really started to understand what had happened at Mycenae. And what they found was fascinating. Mycenae shows multiple phases of destruction and rebuilding in the final years of the Bronze Age. The palace was destroyed around 1200 BCE, but the site wasn't completely abandoned. There was some kind of reoccupation, some attempt to rebuild. But the later phases were much poorer, much simpler. The massive administrative apparatus was gone. The specialized workshops disappeared. The imports from distant lands stopped coming. Eventually, by around 1100 BCE, even this diminished occupation ended. Mycenae was basically abandoned. It would be reoccupied in later periods, but it would never again be the great center of power it had been in the Bronze Age. Similar patterns show up at other Mycenaean sites. Tiryns, Pylos, Thebes, all show destruction layers around 1200 BCE, followed by either immediate abandonment or a period of impoverished reoccupation before final abandonment. The palace centers were gone by 1100 BCE, and they were never rebuilt. What's particularly striking is the uniformity of the pattern. It's not like some sites were destroyed while others flourished. They all went down within a generation or two of each other. That's what makes it a systemic collapse rather than just local problems. Now let's talk about Hattusa, the Hittite capital. This site is in central Turkey, carved into the mountains, and it's absolutely massive. The city walls alone are over 6 kilometers long, enclosing an area of about 180 hectares. That's huge for an ancient city. And those walls are incredible. Massive stone foundations topped with mud brick, with towers and gates decorated with carved reliefs of gods and kings. The Great Temple of Hattusa was one of the largest religious complexes in the ancient world. The royal palace sprawled across the hillside. The archives contain thousands of cuneiform tablets in multiple languages: Hittite, Akkadian, Hurrian, even some texts in languages we still can't identify. And then, around 1190 BCE, everyone just left. The city was abandoned. There's evidence of some burning, but not the kind of massive conflagration you'd expect from a city being sacked. It looks more like the inhabitants packed up what they could carry and evacuated, and then maybe some fires broke out later, either accidentally or deliberately set by the departing population or by looters who came afterward. The tablets in the archives just stop. There's no dramatic final entry, no "Oh God, the enemy is at the gates" message. Just routine administrative texts, and then nothing. The scribes stopped writing, the king disappeared from the historical record, and the great Hittite empire ceased to exist. Why did they abandon Hattusa? We don't know for sure. Some scholars think there was a major drought, that the city's water supply failed and it couldn't support its population anymore. Others think there was political upheaval, maybe a civil war, and the capital was abandoned as rival factions fought for control. Still others think it was famine, plague, attacks from outside enemies, or some combination of all of these. What we do know is that Hattusa was never reoccupied as a major city. People lived in the area in later periods, but they didn't rebuild the great capital. It just sat there, empty, the massive walls slowly crumbling, the temples and palaces falling into ruin, until archaeologists started digging in the early 20th century. Let's head to the Levant and talk about Ugarit some more, because this site is absolutely crucial for understanding the Bronze Age collapse. Ugarit was excavated starting in 1929 by French archaeologists, and what they found was mind-blowing. Ugarit in its heyday was a cosmopolitan metropolis. The texts we found there are in 8 different languages and 5 different scripts. Think about that for a second. This wasn't some provincial backwater. This was a hub of international trade and culture, a place where merchants from Egypt, Mesopotamia, Anatolia, Cyprus, and the Aegean all came together to do business. The city had multiple temples, a royal palace, residential quarters for wealthy merchants, industrial areas where craftsmen worked in bronze and pottery and textiles, and a port that welcomed ships from across the Mediterranean. The king of Ugarit corresponded with the great kings of Egypt, the Hittite Empire, and other major powers. Ugarit was punching way above its weight in terms of international influence. The archives at Ugarit are incredible. We have business contracts, legal texts, religious hymns, literary works, diplomatic correspondence, administrative records, a complete picture of life in a late Bronze Age city. And because the city was destroyed and never rebuilt, all of this material was preserved in situ, like a snapshot frozen in time. The texts from the final years of Ugarit are haunting. There's a letter from the king of Ugarit to the king of Alashia that I mentioned earlier, desperately asking for help. There's another letter that talks about 7 enemy ships appearing off the coast and burning cities. There are texts about grain shortages, about the king sending ships to buy food from other places because Ugarit didn't have enough. And then the city burned. The destruction was thorough and sudden. Buildings collapsed, burned materials sealed the destruction layers, and the site was never reoccupied. When archaeologists excavated Ugarit, they found evidence of hasty flight, valuable objects left behind, archives abandoned in place, kilns with pottery still waiting to be fired. One of the most striking finds was a collection of bronze tools and weapons that had been buried in the final days of the city, probably by someone who hoped to come back and retrieve them later. They never did. The cache sat underground for 3,000 years until archaeologists dug it up. The destruction of Ugarit was so complete that even the name of the city was forgotten. In later periods, nobody remembered that there had ever been a great city at this location. It wasn't until modern archaeologists started digging and found the cuneiform tablets that we even knew Ugarit had existed. That's how total the Bronze Age collapse was in some places. Not just cities destroyed, but their very memory erased from human consciousness. Over in Egypt, let's talk about Medinet Habu, the mortuary temple of Ramesses III. This is where we have the most detailed descriptions of the Sea Peoples and the battles that Ramesses fought against them. The reliefs on the walls at Medinet Habu are incredibly detailed. They show naval battles with remarkable specificity. You can see the design of the ships, the weapons the warriors are using, even details of their clothing and hairstyles. The Egyptian ships are shown ramming the enemy vessels, Egyptian archers are shooting arrows, hand-to-hand combat is happening on the decks. The land battle scenes are equally detailed. They show the sea peoples arriving with ox carts loaded with families and possessions. This isn't an army, this is a migration of entire peoples. There are women and children in those carts, which supports the theory that these were refugees as much as invaders. The accompanying hieroglyphic texts describe the battles in triumphant terms. Of course, Ramesses III presents himself as the savior of Egypt, the great warrior who defeated the foreign invaders and saved civilization. And he probably did save Egypt, or at least bought it some more time. But the cost was enormous. After Ramesses III, Egypt went into a tailspin. His successors were weak, their reigns short and ineffective. The new kingdom limped along for another century or so, but it was a shadow of its former self. Egypt had survived the Bronze Age collapse, but it had been badly wounded in the process. Here's something that really gets me: tomb robbery. During the late New Kingdom and the period immediately following, tomb robbery became absolutely rampant in Egypt. We have detailed court records of trials of tomb robbers, including their confessions describing how they broke into the tombs of pharaohs in the Valley of the Kings and stripped them of their treasures. These weren't random criminals. Some of them were officials, people who were supposed to be guarding the tombs. The social breakdown was so severe that even sacred sites, the burial places of god-kings, weren't safe. People were so desperate, the economy was so trashed, that they were willing to violate the most sacred taboos of Egyptian culture to get their hands on gold and precious materials they could sell. Think about what that means. Egyptian culture was incredibly conservative, incredibly bound by tradition and religious belief. The idea of disturbing the rest of a pharaoh, of stealing from the dead, was about as horrifying as you could get. But people did it anyway, in large numbers, because the alternative was starvation. That's the level of social breakdown we're talking about. That's how bad things got, even in Egypt, which survived better than most. Let me tell you about a site that doesn't get talked about enough: Lachish, in the southern Levant. Lachish was a major fortified city in the Bronze Age, strategically located on the route between Egypt and the interior of Canaan. It had massive walls, a well-built palace, evidence of considerable wealth and sophistication. Lachish was destroyed around 1150 BCE. The destruction layer shows evidence of a massive fire that burned so hot it vitrified the mud bricks, turned them into a kind of crude glass. That takes temperatures of over 1000 degrees Celsius. This wasn't a small fire. This was an inferno that consumed the entire city. After the destruction, Lachish was abandoned for a while, then reoccupied on a much smaller scale. The later settlement was poorer, simpler, less sophisticated. The writing system was lost. The people who reoccupied Lachish were illiterate, at least for a few generations. Similar patterns show up all over the southern Levant. Cities destroyed, abandoned, or reoccupied on a reduced scale, loss of literacy and sophisticated material culture. It's the same story everywhere you look. But you know what's fascinating? In some places, life went on relatively normally. Some villages and small towns show no break in occupation, no destruction layers. For the farmers and shepherds living in these rural areas, life probably got harder. Trade declined, luxury goods became unavailable, insecurity increased, but they weren't experiencing the catastrophic urban collapse that hit the palace centers. This is important because it reminds us that the Bronze Age collapse wasn't uniformly catastrophic everywhere. It hit the complex, centralized, urban societies the hardest. Rural communities, which were less integrated into the palace economies, were better able to adapt and survive. In some ways, this makes sense. If you're a farmer in a small village, growing your own food and making your own tools, you're not as vulnerable to the collapse of international trade networks. You're not dependent on the palace for redistribution of goods. You can ride out the storm by just keeping your head down and focusing on survival. It was the people who were most integrated into the Bronze Age system. The palace officials, the merchants, the craftsmen, the scribes, who suffered the most when that system collapsed. They'd specialized, they'd become dependent on the complex economic and social structures of their time, and when those structures failed, they didn't have fallback options. There's a lesson in that, I think. specialization and complexity bring enormous benefits. The Bronze Age world achieved things that would have been impossible in a simpler society. But they also create vulnerabilities. When the system works, it works great. When it fails, the collapse can be catastrophic. Let's talk about Troy for a minute. Yeah, that Troy, the one from the Iliad. Troy 7a, the archaeological layer that corresponds to the time of the Bronze Age collapse, shows evidence of destruction and upheaval consistent with the pattern we see everywhere else. The city was damaged, possibly attacked, possibly destroyed by earthquake, we're not entirely sure. What's interesting is that Troy survived better than many other sites. The city was rebuilt after the destruction of Troy 7a, and it continued to be occupied through the Dark Age and into later periods. Troy wasn't as dependent on the palace economies of the Aegean. It was strategically located on the Dardanelles, controlling access to the Black Sea, and that geographic advantage continued to matter even after the collapse. But the Troy of the Iron Age was different from Bronze Age Troy. It was smaller, poorer, less connected to the wider world. Like everywhere else, it had suffered from the collapse, even if it had survived better than most. Some scholars think the Trojan War, if it happened at all, might have been part of the chaos of the Bronze Age collapse. Maybe the Mycenaean Greeks really did mount an expedition against Troy around 1200 BCE, not for Helen's face that launched 1,000 ships, but for economic reasons, trying to seize control of trade routes as their world fell apart around them. Maybe the story Homer tells is a distorted memory of the violence and upheaval of the collapse period. Or maybe the Trojan War is entirely fictional, a story made up by later Greeks to explain the ruins they could see all around them. We may never know for sure. But the important point is this. The Trojan War, whether real or fictional, is set at exactly the moment of the Bronze Age collapse. The greatest story in Greek literature is about the end of an age, the fall of a great city, the death of heroes, the beginning of suffering and wandering and loss. That can't be a coincidence. The cultural memory of the collapse was so strong that it shaped the foundational myths of Greek civilization. Now let me take you back to one of the big questions. What role did climate change play in all of this? We have pretty good evidence that the eastern Mediterranean experienced significant drought in the late 13th and early 12th centuries BCE. Paleoclimate data from sediment cores, pollen analysis, and isotope studies of ancient wood and shells all point to drier conditions during this period. Rainfall declined, rivers carried less water, agriculture became more difficult. In a world where most people were subsistence farmers, dependent on rainfall for their crops, drought was a disaster. A bad year meant hunger. Multiple bad years in a row meant famine. And famine meant people on the move, looking for anywhere they might survive. There's a theory, and it's pretty compelling, that climate change didn't cause the Bronze Age collapse directly, but it was a major stress factor that made everything else worse. The Bronze Age civilizations had dealt with droughts before, but a severe, prolonged drought hitting at the same time as plague, at the same time as political instability, at the same time as disruption of trade routes? That was too much. The system couldn't handle multiple crises simultaneously. Think of it like this. Imagine you're juggling 3 balls. You're pretty good at it, you can keep all 3 in the air indefinitely. But then someone throws you a 4th ball, and a 5th, and a 6th. At some point, you're going to drop all of them. That's what happened to the Bronze Age world. They were juggling drought, plague, population movements, economic stress, political instability, too many crises all at once. And because everything was interconnected, when one system failed, it caused others to fail. Drought led to crop failures. Crop failures led to famine. Famine led to population movements and violence. Violence disrupted trade. Disrupted trade meant no tin for bronze. No bronze meant economic collapse. Economic collapse meant the palace administrations couldn't function. And without the palaces, the whole complex system fell apart. It's called a systems collapse, and it's one of the most frightening things that can happen to a civilization. Not a single catastrophic event that you can point to and say, this is what killed us, but a cascade of interconnected failures that feed on each other and spiral out of control. Make sure you're still subscribed, because we're about to dive even deeper into this rabbit hole. Drop a comment and let me know if you're learning stuff you never knew before, because we've still got a long way to go on this journey through the darkest period of the ancient world. Let's talk about what archaeologists call palace destruction layers, and what they can tell us about the nature of the collapse. When you excavate an ancient site and you find a destruction layer, a level where buildings were burned or torn down, where there's evidence of violence and upheaval, you can learn a lot from the details. The thickness of the ash layer tells you how intense the fire was. The type of debris tells you what kinds of buildings were destroyed. The presence or absence of bodies tells you whether people had time to flee or were caught in the destruction. The objects left behind tell you whether the inhabitants had warning to pack up their valuables or whether they had to run for their lives with nothing but the clothes on their backs. At many Bronze Age sites, the destruction layers tell a complicated story. Some show evidence of careful preparation before the end, valuables buried for safekeeping, defensive walls hastily reinforced, extra weapons stockpiled. This suggests the inhabitants knew trouble was coming and tried to prepare. But the preparations didn't help. The cities fell anyway. Other sites show evidence of sudden, catastrophic destruction. Buildings collapsed, fire swept through, and the inhabitants fled or died with little warning. These sites often have valuable objects left in place: jewelry, bronze weapons, precious materials, things that people would have taken with them if they'd had time. The fact that these objects were abandoned tells us the destruction was swift and unexpected. And then there are sites like Hattusa, where there's surprisingly little evidence of violence. The city was abandoned, yes, but it wasn't necessarily destroyed in battle. It's almost like the population just decided to leave, packed up what they could carry, and walked away. Maybe they knew the city couldn't be defended. Maybe they knew the water supply was failing. Maybe they just gave up. That's actually more haunting than evidence of a violent assault. At least with a battle, you can understand what happened. With abandonment, you're left wondering, what did they know that we don't? What were they fleeing from? What made them give up on a city that had stood for centuries? Let me tell you about a specific archaeological find that really brings this whole period to life: the Uluburun shipwreck. In 1982, a sponge diver off the coast of Turkey discovered an ancient shipwreck at a depth of about 44 meters, near a place called Uluburun. When archaeologists excavated it over the next decade, they found one of the richest and most important Bronze Age sites ever discovered. The ship sank around 1300 BCE, about a century before the main collapse, but it gives us an incredible window into the interconnected world of the late Bronze Age Mediterranean. The cargo was insane. 10 tons of copper ingots from Cyprus, 1 ton of tin ingots, probably from Afghanistan or maybe Central Asia, glass ingots from Mesopotamia, ebony from Egypt, elephant ivory from Syria or Egypt, hippopotamus teeth, ostrich eggshells, amber from the Baltic, dozens of jars of terebinth resin used in perfume and incense, pottery from Cyprus, Canaan, and Mycenaean Greece, weapons, tools, jewelry, scarabs, a gold chalice, even some exotic items like a folding wooden writing board. This wasn't just a cargo ship. This was a floating treasure house, carrying luxury goods worth a king's ransom. The items came from all over the known world, from Britain to Afghanistan, from Scandinavia to Africa. This one ship demonstrates just how extensive and sophisticated the Bronze Age trade networks were. But here's what gets me: within a century of this ship sinking, those trade networks would be gone. Ships like this one would stop sailing. The merchants who organized these expeditions would be dead or ruined. The palaces that bought these luxury goods would be in ruins. The whole system would have collapsed. The Uluburun ship is like a time capsule showing us the Bronze Age world at its peak, at the height of its prosperity and interconnection. And knowing what came next makes it bittersweet. All that wealth, all that sophistication, all those connections spanning thousands of miles. It all fell apart within a few generations. Let's talk about something else that's crucial to understanding the collapse: the economics of bronze production. Bronze, as I mentioned earlier, is an alloy of copper and tin. Copper was relatively abundant. There were major sources in Cyprus, Sardinia, the Balkans, Spain. But tin was rare. The major tin sources were way out in Afghanistan, possibly in Cornwall in Britain, maybe in Bohemia or Brittany. Getting tin from these distant sources to the Mediterranean required complex trade networks spanning huge distances. The typical ratio for bronze is about 90% copper to 10% tin. That means you need a lot less tin than copper, which is good because tin was so much harder to get. But you still need it. Without tin, you can't make bronze. And without bronze, you're in serious trouble because your entire civilization runs on bronze tools and weapons. So what happens when the trade routes break down? When the overland caravans from Afghanistan stop coming because of warfare or political collapse in Central Asia? When the ships from Cornwall stop arriving because piracy has made the Mediterranean too dangerous? When the merchant networks that connected producers and consumers fall apart? You run out of tin. And when you run out of tin, you can't make new bronze. You can recycle old bronze objects, melting them down and recasting them, but eventually that's not enough. The supply of bronze starts to decline. And a declining supply of bronze means less agricultural production, because you need bronze tools to farm efficiently. Less military capacity, because you need bronze weapons and armor. Less craft production, less trade, less of everything that depends on metal tools. This creates a vicious cycle. Less bronze means weaker economies, which means less ability to maintain long-distance trade networks, which means even less tin arriving, which means even less bronze production. It spirals downward. There's evidence from the late Bronze Age of bronze becoming scarce and valuable. We find hordes of broken bronze objects, old tools, damaged weapons, scrap metal, buried in the ground, probably by people who plan to dig them up later and recycle them. We find bronze objects being repaired and reused long past the point where they should have been replaced. We find a decline in the quality of bronze objects, with more tin being substituted with other materials or bronze being adulterated with other metals. This is what economic decline looks like in the archaeological record. Not a sudden catastrophic crash, but a gradual degradation, things getting worse and worse over time until the system can't function anymore. And here's the kicker. The people who were developing iron technology, mainly the Hittites, could have solved this problem. Iron is much more common than copper or tin. It's harder to work, you need higher temperatures to smelt it properly. But once you figure out the techniques, iron is abundant. You can make all the tools and weapons you need without depending on long-distance trade for rare materials. But the Hittites kept iron technology secret. They had a monopoly and they weren't about to share. So when the Hittite Empire collapsed, the knowledge of iron working spread, yes, but it spread into a world that was already falling apart. The Iron Age eventually emerged from the ruins of the Bronze Age, but it took centuries for iron technology to really take off and replace bronze. If the Hittites had shared their iron technology earlier, if it had spread throughout the Bronze Age world before the collapse, would things have been different? Would the civilizations have been able to survive the crisis if they hadn't been so dependent on long-distance tin trade? We'll never know, but it's an interesting what. Let me take you to Mesopotamia for a minute, because we haven't talked much about that region and it's important to the story. Mesopotamia, the land between the rivers, in what's now Iraq, was the cradle of civilization. Writing was invented there, the first cities were built there, the first complex states emerged there. By the late Bronze Age, Mesopotamia was divided between several powers: the Assyrians in the north, the Babylonians in the south, various smaller kingdoms and city-states in between. And you know what's interesting? Mesopotamia weathered the Bronze Age collapse better than the Mediterranean world did. There was disruption, sure. Trade declined, some cities were abandoned, there was political upheaval. But there wasn't the catastrophic collapse we see in Greece or Anatolia or the Levant. Why not? A few reasons, probably. First, Mesopotamia wasn't as dependent on maritime trade as the Mediterranean civilizations. The really important stuff, grain, dates, wool, was produced locally. Second, Mesopotamia had a different political structure. Instead of large palace economies, Mesopotamia had city-states with more decentralized economies. When one city fell, others could continue functioning. Third, Mesopotamia wasn't hit as hard by the population movements that devastated the Mediterranean. The Sea Peoples never made it that far east. That said, Mesopotamia didn't escape unscathed. The Assyrian Empire went through a period of weakness in the late 2nd millennium BCE. Cities like Mari and Emar were destroyed and abandoned. Trade routes were disrupted. But the collapse in Mesopotamia was more of a recession than an apocalypse. This is important because it shows that the Bronze Age collapse wasn't a global phenomenon. It was specific to the Eastern Mediterranean and the regions most closely connected to that economic system. Places that were more peripheral to that system, like Mesopotamia, suffered less. Or take Egypt. Egypt was badly hurt, but it survived as a coherent state. Why? Partly geography, Egypt was more isolated, protected by deserts on both sides. Partly political structure. The Egyptian pharaonic system was incredibly resilient, having survived multiple crises over the previous 2,000 years. Partly economy. Egypt was agriculturally self-sufficient, not dependent on imports for basic necessities. The places that collapsed hardest were the ones that were most tightly integrated into the Bronze Age Mediterranean trade network and most dependent on the palace economy system. The Mycenaean palaces, the Hittite Empire, the Levantine city-states. These were the heart of the system, and when the system failed, they fell the hardest. This teaches us something important about globalization and interconnection. Being connected to a wider system brings huge benefits: access to resources, ideas, technologies, markets. But it also creates vulnerabilities. When the system is working, great. When the system fails, you fail with it. The places that survived best were the ones that maintained some degree of self-sufficiency, that didn't put all their eggs in the basket of international trade and complex palace bureaucracies. Again, there's a lesson there for our modern world. We're way more interconnected than the Bronze Age world ever was. Which means we enjoy way more benefits. You can get products from anywhere in the world delivered to your door in days. But it also means we're vulnerable in ways we don't fully appreciate. If the global system that provides us with food, energy, technology, and everything else were to fail, most of us would be completely screwed. We've specialized to the point where very few people know how to actually produce the basic necessities of life. The Bronze Age collapse is a warning about the dangers of over-specialization and over-reliance on complex systems. But let me get back to the historical narrative, because there's more story to tell. One of the most fascinating questions about the Bronze Age collapse is, what happened to the survivors? Where did all the people go? The population of the Eastern Mediterranean dropped by something like 50 to 75% over the course of the late 13th and 12th centuries BCE. That's millions of people who just disappeared from the archaeological record. Some of them died, obviously, from plague, famine, violence. But not all of them. So where did the survivors go? Some of them probably moved to more remote areas. The archaeological surveys show population declining in the lowlands and coastal areas, but increasing slightly in mountain regions and other marginal areas. People were moving to places that were easier to defend, even if they were harder to farm. Some of them probably became pastoralists, giving up agriculture in favor of herding sheep and goats. Pastoral societies leave less archaeological trace than agricultural ones, fewer permanent structures, less pottery, fewer artifacts. So a shift toward pastoralism would make it look like the population had crashed even more than it actually had. Some of them probably moved to regions that aren't as well studied archaeologically. The interior of Anatolia, the Arabian Peninsula, the mountains of Transcaucasia. These areas haven't been as intensively surveyed as places like Greece and the Levantine coast. There could be populations that survived the collapse in these peripheral areas that we just haven't found yet. And some of them, as we've discussed, became the Sea Peoples, the migrants and refugees who moved south looking for new lands to settle. The Philistines ended up on the southern Levantine coast. Other groups probably ended up in Egypt, Sardinia, Sicily, North Africa, who knows where else. The picture that emerges is of massive population displacement and social disruption. People fleeing from collapsing states, from famine and plague, from violence and insecurity. Families torn apart, communities scattered, the social fabric of an entire civilization shredded. And in the middle of all this chaos, in the dark years when the palaces had fallen and literacy had been lost and trade had stopped, somehow people managed to keep going. They survived, they adapted, they preserved what they could of the old culture and slowly started building something new. Let me tell you about a site that exemplifies this transition. Lefkandi, on the island of Euboea in Greece. Lefkandi shows continuous occupation through the Dark Age, which is unusual. Most sites were abandoned. But what's really interesting is what kind of settlement it was. There are no palaces, no monumental architecture, no signs of centralized authority. Instead, there are longhouses, simpler structures, evidence of a more egalitarian society. But the people at Lefkandi weren't completely isolated. They were still trading, on a reduced scale. Archaeologists have found pottery from Cyprus, Egypt, and the Levant at Lefkandi, dated to the 10th and 9th centuries BCE. This shows that maritime trade never completely stopped, even at the darkest point of the Dark Age. It was greatly reduced, yes, but not eliminated. And at Lefkandi, they found something absolutely stunning. A massive building from around 1000 BCE, about 50 meters long, containing the burial of a high-status individual with incredibly rich grave goods, including bronze weapons, gold jewelry, and prestige objects from distant lands. The man was buried with a woman, possibly his wife, and 4 horses. This building was unlike anything else from the Dark Age. It was huge, it required massive resources to build, and the grave goods were extraordinary. After the burial, the building was deliberately dismantled and covered with a mound. What this tells us is that even in the depths of the Dark Age, even after the collapse of the palace economies and the loss of writing and all the catastrophes of the collapse, there were still people with wealth and power. Society hadn't become completely flat and egalitarian. There were still elites, still social hierarchy, still the ability to mobilize resources for impressive projects. But it was different from the Bronze Age. This wasn't a palace with a bureaucracy and scribes and specialized craftsmen. This was probably a warrior chief, someone who led by personal charisma and martial prowess rather than by administrative control of an economic system. The world had changed, and the forms of leadership had changed with it. Lefkandi is a bridge between the Bronze Age and the Iron Age, showing us how Greek society evolved during the Dark Centuries. And it gives us hope, in a way, because it shows that even at the worst point, even when everything seemed lost, people were still capable of creating, building, achieving remarkable things. Let's talk about writing, because the loss and rediscovery of writing is one of the most dramatic aspects of the Bronze Age collapse. Linear B, the script used by the Mycenaean Greeks, disappeared completely around 1200 BCE. The last tablets date to the destruction of the palaces. After that, nothing. For about 400 years, nobody in Greece wrote anything down. At all. This wasn't because the knowledge was lost and nobody remembered how to write. It was because writing, in the Bronze Age, served a very specific purpose: palace administration. Linear B was used exclusively for keeping economic records. Lists of sheep, jars of oil, rations for workers, allocations of bronze. That's what Linear B tablets record. It wasn't used for literature, religion, personal correspondence, or anything else. When the palaces fell, the bureaucracy that used Linear B disappeared. And without that bureaucracy, there was no use for writing. The skill probably lingered for a generation or two. There were probably still some people who could read and write Linear B in the early Dark Age. But they had no reason to use the skill, no one to teach it to, and eventually it died out completely. By the time the Greeks started writing again, around 800 BCE, Linear B was completely forgotten. The Greeks of the Archaic period couldn't read the tablets left by their Bronze Age ancestors. They didn't even know the tablets were writing. They thought they were just decorative patterns. The writing system the Greeks eventually adopted was completely different: the Phoenician alphabet, which they borrowed and modified. This alphabet was simpler, more versatile, and more democratic than Linear B. It could be used for any purpose, not just palace accounting. It could be learned by anyone, not just specialized scribes. It was the foundation of all European writing systems, including the one you're reading right now. But the 400 years between the death of Linear B and the adoption of the alphabet represents an incredible loss. 4 centuries without written records. Think about what that means. No histories, no laws, no literature, no personal documents. Everything that happened in those 4 centuries has to be reconstructed from archaeology and from dim memories preserved in oral tradition. We call it the Greek Dark Age, and it's dark in a very literal sense. We can't see what happened because there are no written sources to illuminate it. Other regions experienced similar losses. The Hittite cuneiform script disappeared with the Hittite Empire. Ugaritic, a cuneiform alphabet used at Ugarit and a few other sites, vanished when those cities were destroyed. In the Levant, writing declined drastically, though it never completely disappeared the way it did in Greece. Only in Egypt and Mesopotamia did literacy survive continuously through the collapse. And even there, the number of people who could read and write declined sharply. The loss of literacy had profound consequences. Without writing, you can't maintain complex administrative systems. You can't preserve accurate records of the past. You can't transmit technical knowledge efficiently across generations. You're dependent on memory and oral tradition, which are valuable but limited. The societies that emerged from the Bronze Age collapse had to rebuild literacy almost from scratch. And when they did, they often chose different writing systems, simpler and more accessible than the ones their Bronze Age ancestors had used. That's actually kind of interesting when you think about it. The collapse destroyed a lot, but it also cleared the ground for innovation. The alphabetic writing systems that emerged in the Iron Age were, in many ways, superior to the syllabic scripts of the Bronze Age. They were easier to learn, more flexible, more democratic. If the Bronze Age palace bureaucracies had survived, they might have clung to their old writing systems, and the alphabet might never have been widely adopted. Sometimes, destruction creates opportunities for progress. Not always, and not without tremendous cost, but sometimes. Alright, let's talk about religion and how people tried to make sense of what was happening to their world. In the ancient world, people understood disasters through religious frameworks. If the crops failed, it was because the gods were angry. If a plague struck, it was divine punishment. If your city was destroyed, it was because you'd offended some deity and they'd withdrawn their protection. We have texts from the late Bronze Age showing people desperately trying to appease the gods. Extra offerings at temples, special rituals, prayers for deliverance. The Hittite texts from the final years of the empire include prayers asking the gods why they're angry and what can be done to make things right. There's a series of prayers by a Hittite king named Mycenaeans II, from a bit before the final collapse, dealing with a plague that had struck Anatolia. Mycenaeans is basically asking the gods, "Why are you doing this? What did we do wrong? Please tell us so we can make it right." The prayers are heartbreaking in their desperation. Mycenaeans promises to do anything the gods want, make any offering, perform any ritual, if they'll just stop the plague. He even suggests that maybe the plague is punishment for some sin his father committed, and if that's the case, he's sorry and he'll make amends. This is how people understood disease in the ancient world. It was divine punishment, and the way to stop it was through religious action. We know now that plagues are caused by microorganisms, that they spread through contact and can be controlled with quarantine and hygiene and medicine. But the Bronze Age people didn't know that. They thought they were being punished by angry gods. And imagine how frustrating and terrifying that must have been. You're doing everything your religion tells you to do. You're making offerings, performing rituals, praying constantly. But the plague keeps spreading. People keep dying. Your world keeps falling apart. And you don't understand why. What did you do wrong? Why won't the gods listen? Why won't they help? Some people probably lost faith. If the gods won't protect you even when you're doing everything right, what's the point of worshiping them? Other people probably became more fanatical, convinced that they weren't doing enough, that they needed to try harder, sacrifice more, pray more fervently. Religious systems were destabilized along with everything else. The great temples that had stood for centuries were destroyed or abandoned. The priesthoods that had maintained religious traditions were scattered or killed. Religious texts and rituals were lost. And in the aftermath, new religious ideas emerged. The Iron Age saw the development of new theological concepts, new ways of thinking about divinity and humanity's relationship to the divine. Ethical monotheism, the idea of a single God who cares about human morality, emerged from the ruins of the Bronze Age polytheistic systems. Again, destruction creating space for innovation. The collapse of the old religious certainties allowed new ideas to flourish. Now I want to talk about something that's often overlooked, the environmental impact of the Bronze Age collapse. When populations crash and cities are abandoned, what happens to the landscape? In the short term, it actually recovers. Forests regrow, wildlife populations increase, rivers run cleaner. The intensive agriculture and deforestation of the Bronze Age had put a lot of pressure on the Mediterranean environment. When that pressure was suddenly removed, nature bounced back. Pollen studies show forests expanding in Greece and Anatolia during the Dark Age. Areas that had been cleared for agriculture reverted to wilderness. This probably made hunting and gathering easier for the survivors, which may have helped them get through the worst years. But in the long term, the collapse meant that a lot of agricultural knowledge was lost. The Bronze Age farmers had developed sophisticated techniques for terracing hillsides, managing water resources, maintaining soil fertility. When the population crashed and people abandoned the marginal lands, that knowledge was lost. It would take centuries to fully redevelop those techniques. There's also the question of what happened to domesticated animals when the system collapsed. The palace economies kept huge flocks of sheep and herds of cattle, carefully managed and recorded. When the palaces fell, what happened to all those animals? Some were probably slaughtered for food by desperate people. Some may have been driven off by raiders. But some probably went feral, especially sheep and goats. Feral populations of these animals can actually be pretty destructive to the environment, overgrazing hillsides and preventing forest regrowth. So the environmental impact of the collapse was complex, in some ways beneficial, in some ways harmful, and overall representing a major disruption to the relationship between humans and the Mediterranean landscape. Let me bring this back to the human level again, because we can't forget that behind all the archaeological data and historical analysis, this was a catastrophe that affected millions of individual people. Think about a child born around 1220 BCE, right at the beginning of the collapse. This kid's grandparents would have lived in the stable, prosperous world of the late Bronze Age. They would have known a world of palaces and trade and specialized craftsmen and literacy and all the achievements of Bronze Age civilization. The child's parents would have lived through the beginning of the crisis. They would have seen things starting to go wrong, harvests failing, trade declining, rumors of trouble in distant lands. But they might have thought it was temporary, that things would get better. They'd never known anything but the Bronze Age system. They couldn't imagine it actually collapsing. But the child would grow up in a world that was falling apart. By the time they were 10 years old, the nearest palace would probably be in ruins. By the time they were 20, literacy would be disappearing, trade would have crashed, and the population would be in free fall. This person would spend their entire life in crisis mode, in survival mode. They'd never know peace or prosperity. They'd watch the world get worse year after year. They'd bury parents, siblings, friends, probably some of their own children. They'd go hungry more often than not. They'd live in constant fear of violence, disease, starvation. And when this person got old and told their grandchildren stories about the past, those children wouldn't really believe them. Great palaces made of stone? Ships sailing from distant lands bringing exotic goods? People who could make marks on clay that spoke? Kings who lived like gods? It would sound like fantasy, like the ravings of a senile old person. But the old person would insist, it was real. I was there. I saw it. The world used to be different. It used to be better. And maybe, just maybe, those grandchildren would remember. Maybe they'd pass the stories on to their own grandchildren. And maybe, centuries later, those dimly remembered stories would become the legends that Homer wove into the Iliad and the Odyssey. That's how cultural memory works. That's how the Bronze Age world, though destroyed, was never completely forgotten. And you know what? We should be grateful for that. We should be grateful that the survivors of the Bronze Age collapse kept telling their stories, kept passing on what they remembered, kept insisting that the past had been different and greater and worth remembering. Because without those stories, we'd know almost nothing about the Bronze Age world. The archaeological evidence would be there, sure, but it would be mute, unable to tell us what it all meant. It's the combination of archaeology and tradition, physical remains and remembered stories, that allows us to reconstruct what happened. And even then, there's so much we don't know, so much that's lost forever. But we know enough to understand that the Bronze Age collapse was one of the pivotal events in human history. It marked the end of one age and the beginning of another. It destroyed civilizations but also created opportunities for new ones to emerge. It was catastrophic for the people who lived through it, but it ultimately led to innovations and developments that shaped the ancient world and, by extension, our modern world. If you're still with me, and seriously, congratulations if you are, because we've been at this for a while. Make sure you hit that like button and leave a comment. Tell me what part of this story has affected you the most. Tell me what you think we should learn from the Bronze Age collapse. And definitely subscribe, because there's always more history to explore, more stories to tell, more lessons to learn from the past. Let me take you to one more place before we start wrapping this up. Knossos, on the island of Crete. Knossos was the center of Minoan civilization, one of the great Bronze Age cultures of the Mediterranean. The palace at Knossos was massive, a labyrinth of rooms and corridors that may have inspired the Greek legend of the Minotaur. The Minoans were sophisticated, cultured, wealthy. Their art is beautiful even today. Frescoes showing bulls and dolphins and elegantly dressed people, pottery decorated with octopuses and flowers, jewelry of gold and precious stones. But Minoan civilization had already collapsed by the time of the Bronze Age collapse we've been discussing. The palaces on Crete were destroyed around 1450 BCE, about 250 years before the main collapse. After that, Mycenaean Greeks took over Crete, ruling from Knossos using linear B script. So when the Bronze Age collapse hit, Crete had already been through one catastrophe. The Minoan palaces were long gone. The island was under Mycenaean control. And then, around 1200 BCE, that Mycenaean control collapsed too. Knossos was abandoned, along with most other sites on Crete. Crete in the Dark Age was a shadow of its former self. The population declined drastically. The settlements that survived were small and poor. The brilliant artistic traditions of the Minoans were lost. It would take centuries for Crete to recover. But here's what's interesting. Throughout the Dark Age, the Cretans maintained a memory of their glorious past. They remembered that Crete had once been powerful, that Knossos had once been a great center. And when the classical Greeks wrote about Crete, they spoke of King Minos and his palace and his power. The stories had been distorted, mixed with mythology, the Minotaur, Theseus and the Labyrinth, Daedalus and Icarus. But the core memory remained. Crete had once been great. Arthur Evans, when he excavated Knossos in the early 20th century, was partly inspired by these Greek legends. He was looking for the palace of King Minos, the labyrinth where the Minotaur supposedly lived. And lo and behold, he found a massive, complex palace with corridors that twist and turn like a maze. The legends had preserved a memory of real history, even if the details had been mythologized beyond recognition. This happened all over the Bronze Age world. The physical remains were destroyed or buried, but the memories lived on in legend and myth. Troy, Mycenae, Thebes, Knossos, all of them were remembered in Greek literature, even though the classical Greeks had no direct knowledge of what those places had really been like in the Bronze Age. Cultural memory is powerful. Even when everything else is lost, the stories survive. Maybe not in accurate detail, but in broad outline. People remember that there was a great war, even if they get the details wrong. They remember that there were mighty kings and fabulous palaces, even if they misunderstand what those palaces were really like. They remember that the past was different, that their ancestors achieved great things, that there was a time before the darkness. And those memories matter. They shape how cultures understand themselves, how they think about their past and their potential future. The Greeks of the Archaic and Classical periods looked back at the Bronze Age, or at least at the mythologized version of it preserved in Homer and other traditions, as a heroic age, a time of great deeds and legendary figures. That backward glance inspired them to achieve greatness themselves, to live up to the example of their ancestors. Without the memory of the Bronze Age, preserved however imperfectly in myth and legend, Greek civilization might have been very different. Now let's talk about a question that comes up a lot. Could the Bronze Age collapse happen again? Could our modern civilization fall the same way? The short answer is, probably not in exactly the same way, but we definitely face some similar risks. The Bronze Age world collapsed because of a perfect storm of interconnected crises: climate change, plague, economic disruption, political instability, population movements. Each problem made the others worse, creating a downward spiral that the system couldn't escape from. Our world faces similar challenges. Climate change is real and it's going to cause major disruptions: crop failures, droughts, rising sea levels, more extreme weather events. Pandemics remain a threat, as COVID-19 reminded us very forcefully. Economic instability and inequality are growing problems. Political polarization and conflict are increasing. Mass migration is already happening and will likely increase as climate change makes some regions uninhabitable. Sound familiar? It should. These are basically the same problems that brought down the Bronze Age world, just on a larger scale and with different technological parameters. But we have advantages the Bronze Age world didn't. We understand what causes disease and how to control it. We have global communication systems that allow rapid coordination of responses to crises. We have distributed knowledge storage, the internet, libraries, universities all over the world, which makes it much harder for knowledge to be completely lost. We have more diverse and redundant systems in many areas. On the other hand, we also have vulnerabilities the Bronze Age world didn't. We're vastly more dependent on complex technology. Our population is much larger and more densely packed, which makes us more vulnerable to disease. We've depleted a lot of easily accessible resources. We have weapons of mass destruction that could cause catastrophic damage in the event of large-scale conflict. And perhaps most importantly, our systems are often highly optimized for efficiency rather than resilience. Just-in-time supply chains minimize inventory but create fragility. Specialization increases productivity but creates dependencies. Interconnection brings benefits but spreads risks. The Bronze Age collapse teaches us that we need to build resilience into our systems, maintain redundancy even when it seems inefficient, preserve knowledge and skills even when they seem obsolete, and not assume that growth and complexity can continue indefinitely without consequences. We need to learn from history. Because the alternative, ignoring the lessons and assuming it can't happen to us, is how civilizations fall. Let me tell you about one final site, and then we'll start bringing this long journey to a close. Katna, in Syria. Katna was a major city in the Middle and Late Bronze Ages, located at the crossroads of trade routes connecting Mesopotamia, Anatolia, and the Levant. The palace at Katna was enormous, one of the largest in the ancient Near East. The city was wealthy, powerful, politically significant. Katna was destroyed around 1340 BCE, before the main Bronze Age collapse, probably by the Hittites. The city recovered and was rebuilt, but it was destroyed again around 1200 BCE, this time as part of the collapse, and it was never rebuilt. The site was abandoned and eventually forgotten. In 1999, archaeologists excavating at Katna made an astounding discovery. Beneath the palace, they found intact royal tombs containing the burials of Katna's kings from the Middle Bronze Age, along with incredible grave goods. These tombs had somehow escaped looting, preserving treasures that are now some of the finest examples of Bronze Age art and craftsmanship. But what really got to me about Katna is this. When the city was destroyed in 1200 BCE, it was already dealing with the ruins of the previous destruction from 1340 BCE. Parts of the old palace were still in ruins when the final destruction came. The city had never fully recovered from the first catastrophe before the second one hit. This is a pattern we see in multiple places. Cities get destroyed, partially rebuild, and then get hit again before they can fully recover. It's like getting knocked down, struggling to your feet, and getting punched in the face again before you've caught your breath. That's what made the Bronze Age collapse so devastating. It wasn't one crisis. It was crisis after crisis after crisis, each one hitting before people had recovered from the last one. The system never got a chance to stabilize, never got a breather. It was relentless. And eventually, people just gave up. They stopped trying to rebuild the cities. They stopped trying to maintain the palaces and the bureaucracies and the trade networks. They scattered to smaller settlements where they could at least grow their own food and defend themselves. Can you blame them? When the system keeps failing you, when rebuilding just means you'll have more to lose when the next disaster hits, giving up starts to look rational. Katna lay abandoned for nearly 3,000 years before archaeologists started digging there. 3,000 years of silence. A city that had once been great, reduced to a tell, a mound of accumulated ruins, that local farmers avoided because the ground was too rocky to plow. That's what total collapse looks like. Not just decline, not just transformation, but absolute abandonment. The city died and stayed dead, but the memory survived, sort of. Ancient texts mention Katna, so we knew it had existed somewhere. And eventually, modern archaeology, 1555, rediscovered it and brought its story back to light. Nothing is ever truly lost, as long as someone remembers. As long as someone cares enough to dig through the ruins and piece together what happened. That's what we're doing here, you and me, right now. We're remembering. We're honoring the memory of civilizations that fell, of people who suffered and died, of knowledge and beauty that was lost. We're making sure they're not forgotten. And maybe, just maybe, we're learning something that will help us avoid the same fate. So as we drift toward the end of this very long story, let me leave you with some final thoughts. The Bronze Age collapse was a catastrophe of almost unimaginable scale. Millions dead, civilizations destroyed, centuries of accumulated knowledge lost. It was the end of a world, the death of an age. But it wasn't the end of humanity in the Mediterranean. The survivors endured. They adapted. They preserved what they could and built something new from the ruins. The Iron Age civilizations that emerged from the collapse were different from the Bronze Age ones, but in many ways they were better. More democratic, more literate, thanks to the alphabet, more innovative. The classical Greek civilization that we still study and admire today was built on the ruins of the Mycenaean palaces. Sometimes, destruction clears the ground for new growth. Sometimes, the end of one thing is the beginning of something else. That doesn't make the suffering any less real or the loss any less tragic. The people who died in the collapse, the cultures that were destroyed, the knowledge that was lost, those are real losses that we should mourn. But we can also recognize that history didn't end with the Bronze Age collapse. Life continued. People rebuilt. New civilizations emerged. And that should give us hope. Because if the survivors of the Bronze Age collapse could rebuild from almost nothing, if they could preserve their humanity and their culture through the darkest times, then we can face our own challenges with courage and determination. The future isn't predetermined. Collapse isn't inevitable. We can learn from history, we can build resilient systems, we can work together to address the challenges we face. We can choose to be the generation that breaks the cycle, that builds a sustainable civilization that doesn't depend on endless growth and exploitation. Or we can ignore the warnings, assume it can't happen to us, and find out the hard way that civilizations really can fall. The choice is ours. Before I let you drift off to sleep, I want to thank you for joining me on this journey through one of the darkest periods in human history. If you found this valuable, if you learned something, if it made you think, please hit that subscribe button. Leave a comment telling me what you thought. Share this video with someone who might appreciate it. And check out my other content, because history is full of fascinating stories, important lessons, and reminders that we're part of a much longer human journey than just our own lifetimes. The Bronze Age is gone. The palaces are ruins. The scribes are dust. But we remember. And as long as we remember, as long as we learn, as long as we tell these stories, something of that ancient world lives on. Sleep well. Dream of ancient cities and lost civilizations, of heroes and catastrophes, of endings and new beginnings. And when you wake up, remember, you're part of history too. The choices you make, the things you build, the knowledge you preserve or discard, all of it matters. All of it shapes the future. The Bronze Age collapse happened 3,000 years ago, but its lessons are eternal. Civilizations are fragile. Complexity creates vulnerability. Interconnection brings both benefits and risks, and human resilience is the one constant through all the rises and falls of history. We've survived ice ages and plagues, famines and floods, the fall of empires and the collapse of civilizations. We're still here. We're still telling stories. We're still reaching for something better. And that, more than anything else, gives me hope for the future. Good night, everyone. Rest easy. The past is gone but not forgotten. The future is uncertain but not predetermined. And we're all in this together, trying to build something that will last, trying to learn from the mistakes of the past, trying to create a world worth passing on to the next generation. Thank you for listening. Thank you for caring about history. Thank you for being part of this community of curious minds who understand that the past has something to teach us. Until next time, this has been Dreamless Timelines. Keep exploring, keep learning, keep questioning. History is waiting. Sweet dreams. Actually, before you drift off completely, let me pull you back for a bit longer. Because there's so much more to this story, so many layers we haven't fully explored yet. The Bronze Age collapse isn't just about destruction and loss. It's about transformation, adaptation, and the incredible resilience of human beings when faced with the unthinkable. Let me take you deeper into the world of the people who lived through this catastrophe. Not the kings and scribes we've been talking about, but the ordinary folks whose names we'll never know but whose lives tell us the most important parts of the story. Imagine you're a bronzesmith in a small town on the coast of the Levant, around 1185 BCE. Your family has been working bronze for generations. Your great-grandfather learned the craft from his father, who learned it from his father, going back who knows how many generations. This isn't just a job for you. It's your identity, your livelihood, your connection to the past and the future. You work in a small workshop attached to your house. The workshop has a furnace, molds for casting, tools for hammering and shaping metal. You make everything from agricultural tools to weapons to decorative objects. Farmers come to you when their plow blades wear out. Warriors come to you for swords and spearheads. Wealthy merchants commission bronze vessels for their homes. Your workshop is hot, always hot. The furnace burns constantly because getting it hot enough to melt bronze is a process, and you can't afford to let it cool down and have to start over every time you want to cast something. The air smells of charcoal smoke and hot metal. Your hands are scarred from burns and cuts accumulated over years of working with molten bronze and sharp tools. You're good at what you do. Really good. You can judge the temperature of the molten bronze just by looking at its color. You know exactly how much copper and tin to use for different types of objects. More tin for objects that need to be harder, less for objects that need to be more flexible. You can create smooth, even castings with minimal finishing work required. People come from miles around because they know your work is quality. But lately, things have been getting harder. Tin is becoming scarce. The merchants who used to bring it regularly from distant lands are coming less frequently. When they do come, the prices are astronomical. You're having to charge more for your products, and customers are complaining. Some are making do with older tools rather than buying new ones. Some are trying to repair things that really should be replaced. You've started keeping a hoard of bronze scrap, old broken tools, damaged weapons, anything that can be melted down and reused. You guard this hoard jealously because virgin bronze is becoming too expensive. Recycling is the only way to keep working. And then the tin stops coming altogether. 4 months, no merchant arrives with tin. You use up your reserves, then start buying scrap bronze from anyone who has it. But eventually, even that runs out. What do? You're a bronzesmith without bronze. Your entire identity, your livelihood, your family's legacy, all of it depends on a material you can no longer get. Some bronzesmiths start experimenting with iron. Iron is harder to work than bronze. It requires higher temperatures and different techniques, but it's available. There's iron ore in the hills not too far away. If you can figure out how to work it, you might be able to survive. But you're 50 years old. You've been working bronze your entire adult life. Learning a completely new craft at your age is daunting. The techniques are different, the tools are different, the whole process is different. And there's no one to teach you because ironworking is new, and the people who know how to do it, mostly Hittite craftsmen, are keeping the knowledge secret. So you try to figure it out on your own. You experiment with different furnace designs, different temperatures, different techniques. Most of your attempts fail. Iron objects that crack when you try to shape them. Metal that's too brittle to use. Countless failed experiments that waste precious time and resources. Meanwhile, your savings are running out. You have a family to feed. Your wife and children are depending on you. The stress is crushing. Some of your fellow craftsmen give up and become farmers. Others turn to banditry, joining the groups of desperate men who raid outlying villages for food and valuables. A few manage to successfully transition to ironworking and limp along, producing inferior products that nobody really wants but that are better than nothing. And you? Maybe you eventually figure out ironworking and manage to survive, passing on your hard-won knowledge to your children. Maybe you give up on metalworking entirely and find some other way to survive. Maybe you don't survive at all. Disease, starvation, violence, any of the countless ways people died during the collapse. But whatever happens to you personally, you're part of a much larger story. You're witnessing the end of the Bronze Age and the beginning of the Iron Age. The craft your family practiced for generations is becoming obsolete. The world you knew is disappearing, and a new world is being born. That's what technological transition looks like at the human level. Not an abstract shift from one age to another, but real people struggling to adapt, fighting to survive, watching their old certainties crumble away. And multiply that story by millions. Bronzesmiths, farmers, merchants, sailors, soldiers, scribes, priests, laborers. Everyone's life was being appended. Everyone was struggling to adapt to a world that no longer made sense. Let me tell you about another person, a different perspective on the same catastrophe. You're a sailor, a merchant captain, around 1175 BCE. You own a small trading vessel, nothing fancy, but it's seaworthy and it's yours. You've been sailing the Mediterranean since you were a teenager, learning the routes, the winds, the currents, the ports. You know where to buy grain cheap and sell it for a profit. You know which islands produce the best wine. You know the merchants and harbor masters at every major port. Trade is your life. You love the freedom of the sea, the challenge of navigating by the stars, the thrill of completing a successful trading voyage and counting your profits. You've made a good living, supported your family, even set aside some savings for your old age. But the sea is becoming increasingly dangerous. Pirates have always been a problem, but it's gotten much worse lately. Whole fleets of desperate men, many of them probably refugees from collapsed kingdoms in the north, are raiding coastal settlements and attacking trading ships. The old patrol ships that the great kingdoms used to send out to keep the sea lanes safe have disappeared. You're on your own out there. Several times, you've had to flee from pirate ships, throwing cargo overboard to lighten your vessel and outrun them. Once, you were boarded, and you lost everything. Your cargo, most of your savings that you'd hidden on board, even some of your crew who chose to join the pirates rather than starve. You barely escaped with your life. And even when you make it safely to port, the situation there is often chaotic. Cities you've been visiting for years are suddenly abandoned or in ruins. Harbors that used to be bustling with activity are empty. Merchants you've done business with for decades have disappeared, dead, fled, who knows. The ports that are still functioning are desperate for food. Grain prices have gone through the roof because harvests are failing and the agricultural systems are breaking down. You can make huge profits if you can find grain to buy and transport it safely. But finding grain is increasingly difficult, and transporting it is increasingly dangerous. You're getting older. The stress is wearing you down. You've lost friends and crew members to pirates, storms, Disease. Your ship needs repairs that you can barely afford. Your family is begging you to stop sailing and stay home where it's safe. But if you stop sailing, how will you eat? You don't know how to farm. You've been a sailor your entire adult life. The sea is all you know. So you keep going out, keep taking risks, keep trying to make one more profitable voyage. But in your heart, you know the golden age of Mediterranean trade is over. The networks that connected the entire region are falling apart. The security that made trade possible is gone. The wealthy customers who bought exotic goods are dead or impoverished. You're watching an entire way of life disappear, and there's nothing you can do to stop it. Maybe you eventually get killed by pirates or die in a storm. Maybe you make it through and adapt to the new reality, doing smaller-scale coastal trading instead of the long-distance voyages you used to make. Maybe you give up the sea entirely and settle down in some small port town, telling exaggerated stories to your grandchildren about the old days when the Mediterranean was safe and prosperous and you could sail from one end to the other in confidence. Whatever happens to you, you're part of the story of how the Bronze Age trade networks collapsed and how the economic integration of the Mediterranean fell apart. Let me shift perspective one more time. You're a young woman, maybe 19 or 20 years old, living in a village in the hill country of what will eventually be called Israel, around 1160 BCE. Your village is new. It was founded by your parents' generation, people who fled from the coastal cities when things started to fall apart there. The villages in the hills are safer, more defensible, easier to protect from raiders and invaders. The land isn't as fertile as the coastal plain, and farming is harder, but at least you can see enemies coming from a long way off. Life is hard. Brutally hard. You work from before sunrise to after sunset every single day. There are no days off, no vacations, no leisure time. Every moment is devoted to survival. You help tend the small plots of grain that your family grows on the hillside terraces. You gather wild plants that can be eaten, berries, nuts, greens, anything that's edible. You help care for the few goats and sheep that your family owns. You haul water from the spring, a daily task that takes hours because the spring is down in the valley and you have to climb back up the hill carrying heavy jars. You grind grain by hand using a stone mortar and pestle, an exhausting process that leaves your arms aching. You bake flat bread on a hot stone. You spin wool from the sheep into thread, then weave the thread into rough cloth for clothing. You help repair the mud brick house when the winter rains damage it. You tend the sick when disease strikes. You help deliver babies when women in the village give birth. There's no palace to redistribute food during bad harvests. No merchants bringing exotic goods from distant lands. No craftsmen making beautiful objects. No scribes recording events for posterity. Your world has shrunk to your village, the surrounding hills, and the constant struggle to survive. You've never learned to read or write. There's no one to teach you, and even if there were, what would be the point? There's nothing to read, no reason to write. The knowledge that the Bronze Age palaces had armies of scribes who could record everything would seem like fantasy to you. But you know stories. Oh, you know stories. The old people in the village tell stories about the days before the collapse, about great cities and powerful kings and wealth beyond imagining. You're not sure how much to believe. The stories sound exaggerated, impossible. But the old people insist they're true, and sometimes they show you artifacts from the old days, a bronze knife, a piece of decorated pottery, a bead of Egyptian faience, that prove the past really was different. You tell these stories to the children in the village, adding your own embellishments, keeping the memories alive. You don't understand everything you're preserving, but you understand that it matters, that the past shouldn't be forgotten even if it can't be fully understood. Your life will be short. Maybe you'll make it to 40 if you're lucky, but probably not. You'll probably die in childbirth, or from disease, or from an infected wound, or from any of the countless dangers that make life in the Dark Age so precarious. But before you die, you'll pass on the stories. You'll teach your children to survive, to work hard, to help each other, to remember the past. And your children will do the same, and their children, and so on down through the generations. You're part of the chain that connects the Bronze Age world to the Iron Age civilizations that will eventually emerge. You're a link in the preservation of cultural memory, even though you don't think of yourself that way. You're just trying to survive and raise your kids and pass on what you know. But in a larger sense, you're one of the heroes of this story. Because without people like you, people who survived against all odds and kept the memories alive, the Bronze Age world would have been completely forgotten. The stories would have died. The connection to the past would have been severed. You and millions like you are the reason we know anything about the Bronze Age at all. Now, let me take you to a place we haven't discussed much yet, Sardinia. Sardinia, the large island west of Italy, was part of the Bronze Age Mediterranean world, though often on the periphery. The Sardinians developed a unique culture, building thousands of stone towers called nuraghi that still the landscape today. These nuraghi were defensive structures, fortified towers where communities could retreat in times of danger. And boy, did they need them during the Bronze Age collapse. The archaeological evidence from Sardinia shows intense conflict during this period. Many nuraghi show evidence of burning and destruction. Coastal settlements were abandoned as people retreated inland. Hordes of bronze weapons and tools were buried and never retrieved, suggesting people were fleeing in panic. But Sardinia also shows evidence of refugees arriving from other parts of the Mediterranean. New pottery styles appear, new burial customs, new architectural techniques that seem to come from the Aegean or the Levant. Sardinia became a refuge for some of the sea peoples, a place where displaced populations tried to start over. The Sardinians adapted to the crisis by becoming more militarized, more defensive. The nuraghi proliferated during this period, and they became increasingly sophisticated in their design. Some nuraghi developed into complex fortified villages, with multiple towers connected by walls, capable of housing entire communities during sieges. Sardinia survived the Bronze Age collapse better than many other places, partly because it was peripheral enough to avoid the worst of the chaos, partly because the nuraghi provided defensive structures that could protect communities, and partly because the island's geography, mountainous, with many defensible positions, favored defenders over attackers. But Sardinia's isolation also meant it missed out on some of the innovations that would transform the Mediterranean in the Iron Age. Writing didn't reach Sardinia until much later. Urban civilization developed more slowly. In some ways, Sardinia was a backwater, preserved in amber while the rest of the Mediterranean moved forward. Still, the nuraghi stand today as monuments to the Bronze Age collapse. They're physical evidence of how communities responded to crisis by building defenses, by retreating to safer positions, by prioritizing security over everything else. Let's talk about Cyprus again, because I want to go deeper into what happened there. Cyprus suffered terribly during the Bronze Age collapse. Multiple waves of destruction hit the island over several decades. Cities like Nkomi and Kition were burned, rebuilt, burned again, rebuilt again, and finally abandoned. But Cyprus also shows us something interesting: adaptation and resilience. After the initial destructions, some Cypriot communities rebuilt in new locations, often more defensible positions. They moved from coastal sites to inland hills. They simplified their material culture, abandoning the elaborate pottery and architecture of the late Bronze Age in favor of more utilitarian styles. The copper industry, which had made Cyprus wealthy, didn't disappear entirely, but it contracted dramatically. Instead of exporting copper across the entire Mediterranean, Cypriot miners produced on a smaller scale for local markets. The palace economies that had organized large-scale mining and export were gone, but small-scale, family-based mining continued. And Cyprus became a melting pot. Refugees from the Aegean, from Anatolia, from the Levant, all seem to have arrived on Cyprus during and after the collapse. These different groups didn't always get along. There's evidence of conflict between newcomers and established populations, but eventually they blended into new cultural identities. The pottery of Cyprus in the post-collapse period shows this blending. You have shapes and decorative motifs from the Aegean mixed with local Cypriot traditions and influences from the Levant. It's a material culture that represents fusion, adaptation, the creation of something new from the ruins of multiple destroyed civilizations. Cyprus in the Iron Age was different from Bronze Age Cyprus, but it was still Cyprus. The island had survived, adapted, and would eventually thrive again as Phoenician traders started using it as a base for their commercial operations. That's a pattern we see in several places. The collapse was devastating, but it wasn't the end of everything. Adaptation was possible. New forms of organization emerged. Life continued, changed but not extinguished. Let me tell you about a text that always gives me chills, the Instructions of Amenemope, an Egyptian wisdom text that probably dates to the post-collapse period. The Instructions of Amenemope is a collection of moral and practical advice, teachings from a father to his son. And one of the recurring themes is the uncertainty and instability of life. Don't trust in riches, because they can vanish overnight. Don't be violent or aggressive, because violence begets more violence. Be patient, be cautious, be adaptable. This is very different from earlier Egyptian wisdom texts, which tend to be much more confident and optimistic. The earlier texts assume a stable world where hard work and virtue will be rewarded, where the social order is fixed and reliable. But Amenemope assumes a world of chaos and uncertainty, where nothing is guaranteed and survival requires flexibility and caution. You can feel the shadow of the collapse in this text. The author has lived through times of upheaval and instability. He's seen wealth disappear, social hierarchies overturn, certainties crumble. And he's trying to teach his son how to survive in a world that's become unpredictable and dangerous. Do not covet the property of a poor man, nor hunger for his bread. The property of a poor man is a choking in the throat, it causes the throat to vomit. In other words, don't prey on the weak, because you never know when you might be weak yourself. The social order is unstable, positions can reverse quickly. Do not move the markers on the borders of fields, nor shift the position of the measuring line. Do not be greedy for a cubit of land, nor encroach on the boundaries of a widow. Respect property rights, even when you could get away with violating them, because social order depends on basic fairness and trust. These aren't the teachings of a confident empire at its peak. These are the teachings of a civilization that's been through hell and is trying to figure out how to rebuild on a more stable foundation. The Instructions of Amenemope influenced later wisdom literature, including possibly some of the biblical proverbs. Ideas that emerged from the trauma of the Bronze Age collapse rippled forward through time, shaping how later civilizations thought about ethics, society, and how to live in an uncertain world. That's how cultural trauma works. It doesn't just destroy. It also teaches, shapes, influences the cultures that emerge from the ruins. Speaking of the Bible, let's talk about how the Bronze Age collapse influenced biblical texts and traditions. The Hebrew Bible preserves memories of the collapse period, though often in fragmented and mythologized form. The stories of the Exodus, the conquest of Canaan, the Judges period, these narratives are set roughly in the time of the Bronze Age collapse, and they preserve some genuine historical memories, even if the details are legendary. The story of the Exodus, the Israelites fleeing from Egypt and wandering in the wilderness before conquering Canaan, might preserve a memory of population movements during the collapse. Maybe not a literal mass exodus of millions of people, but groups fleeing from Egypt or from Egyptian-controlled areas of the Levant during the upheavals. The conquest narratives, cities being destroyed, populations being displaced, new groups taking over territories, definitely reflect the reality of the collapse period, even if the specific stories are legendary. Cities really were being destroyed. Populations really were being displaced. New groups really were establishing themselves in territories that had previously been controlled by others. And the Judges period, the era described in the biblical book of Judges, when there was no king in Israel, and local leaders arose to deal with specific crises, sounds a lot like the Dark Age period after the collapse. Decentralized authority, local strongmen, constant low-level conflict, a sense of instability and danger. The Bible's authors, writing centuries after the events, didn't understand that they were describing the Bronze Age collapse. They interpreted events through their own theological frameworks, seeing divine providence and punishment where we see systemic collapse and historical causation. But they preserved memories that help us understand what happened. For instance, the Bible preserves the name Philistines, the Pele set, one of the Sea Peoples groups. The biblical authors didn't know that the Philistines were probably refugees from the Mycenaean world who settled on the Levantine coast during the collapse. They just knew that the Philistines were ancient enemies of Israel. But they preserved the name, and that helps us connect biblical traditions to the broader history of the Bronze Age collapse. Similarly, the Bible preserves memories of Canaanite city-states, which were real political entities in the late Bronze Age. It preserves the knowledge that Egypt had once controlled the Levant but no longer did. It preserves the memory of powerful kingdoms in the north, possibly the Hittite Empire, though the details are garbled. These are fragments of historical memory, preserved in texts that were written for religious purposes by people who didn't understand the larger historical context. But they're valuable fragments nonetheless. The Bronze Age collapse shaped the world that produced the Hebrew Bible. The decentralization of power, the collapse of the palace economies, the disappearance of centralized religious institutions, all of this created space for new religious ideas to develop. Ideas about a single God who wasn't tied to a specific palace or city-state, who was concerned with ethics and justice rather than just ritual offerings, who made demands on rich and poor alike. Would monotheism have developed if the Bronze Age palace systems had survived? Maybe, maybe not. But the collapse certainly created conditions that favored the emergence of new religious ideas. Let me take you back to archaeology for a moment. I want to talk about a specific type of artifact that appears during and after the Bronze Age collapse: crude handmade pottery. Throughout the late Bronze Age, pottery in most regions was made on a potter's wheel by skilled craftsmen. It was often decorated with elaborate painted designs. It was standardized, well-made, aesthetically pleasing. But during the collapse period, in many regions, wheel-made pottery disappears and is replaced by crude handmade pots. These pots are irregular in shape, poorly fired, often ugly. They're functional but nothing more. What does this tell us? It tells us that the specialized craftsmen who made fine pottery were gone, dead, displaced, or doing something else to survive. The people who made the crude handmade pottery weren't trained potters. They were just ordinary people trying to make containers to store food and water using whatever techniques they could figure out on their own. This is what the collapse of specialization looks like in the archaeological record. The division of labor that had allowed Bronze Age societies to produce such sophisticated material culture broke down. Everyone had to become a generalist, doing whatever was necessary to survive, even if they didn't do it very well. Over time, pottery making skills slowly recovered. By the late Dark Age, you start seeing better quality pottery again, though still simpler and less sophisticated than Bronze Age wares. Specialization was gradually rebuilt, but it took centuries. Similar patterns appear in other crafts. Metallurgy became simpler and cruder. Architecture became less sophisticated. Textile production declined in quality. Everything degraded because the social and economic systems that had supported specialized craftsmen were gone. And this wasn't just about losing nice things. Quality tools and containers were essential for economic productivity. Crude tools are less efficient, which means more labor is required to accomplish the same tasks. Poor quality storage vessels mean more food spoilage. Inferior architecture means buildings that don't last as long and don't protect inhabitants as well. The collapse of craftsmanship had real economic consequences that made recovery harder. Let me tell you about something called cultural amnesia, the process by which knowledge is lost across generations. When the Bronze Age palaces fell and literacy disappeared, a huge amount of knowledge was lost. Not just historical records, but technical knowledge, agricultural techniques, administrative practices, religious traditions, literary works, legal codes, everything that had been written down. But even more was lost through the breakdown of master-apprentice relationships. Crafts like bronzeworking, stone masonry, fresco painting, seal engraving, jewelry making, these skills were taught through years of apprenticeship, masters training students who would eventually become masters themselves. When the system collapsed, many master craftsmen died without passing on their knowledge. Or they passed it on incompletely because they were too busy surviving to properly train apprentices. Or their apprentices died young, before they'd fully learned the craft. Over just a generation or two, Centuries of accumulated knowledge could be lost. Techniques that had been refined over generations. Tricks of the trade that made the difference between mediocre and excellent work. Subtle knowledge that couldn't easily be put into words. All of it gone. And once it's lost, it's incredibly hard to rediscover. You can look at a Bronze Age fresco and see that it's beautiful, but if you don't know the specific techniques used to create it, what pigments, what binding agents, what application methods, what surface preparation, you can't reproduce it. You can try, but your results will be inferior. That's what happened across the board during the Bronze Age collapse. Later generations could see that their ancestors had achieved great things, but they couldn't reproduce those achievements because the knowledge of how to do it had been lost. This is cultural amnesia in action. And it's terrifying because it shows how fragile knowledge is. We tend to assume that knowledge, once discovered, is permanent. But it's not. Knowledge exists in people's heads, in active practice, in living traditions. When those people die and those practices stop and those traditions are interrupted, the knowledge dies with them. In our modern world, we have books, digital archives, universities, research institutions, all designed to preserve and transmit knowledge across generations. But even with all these safeguards, knowledge can still be lost. How many ancient crafts and techniques have we lost despite our best efforts? How many more could we lose if our systems of knowledge preservation were disrupted? The Bronze Age collapse is a warning about how easily knowledge can disappear. Let me talk about children for a moment, because we haven't discussed enough how the collapse affected the youngest members of society. Children born during the collapse grew up in a world that was constantly traumatic. Violence, disease, hunger, death. These weren't occasional crises but constant realities. Children regularly watched siblings, parents, friends die. They went hungry more often than not. They lived in fear of raiders, pirates, and invaders. This kind of childhood trauma has lasting effects. It shapes how people see the world, how they relate to others, what they believe is possible. The children of the collapse probably grew up to be cautious, defensive, mistrustful of outsiders. They probably valued security above all else. They probably passed on to their own children a sense that the world is dangerous and unpredictable, that you can't trust complex systems or distant authorities, that the only people you can really rely on are your immediate family and community. This kind of trauma-induced cultural conservatism probably slowed recovery from the collapse. Innovation requires a willingness to take risks, to try new things, to trust that the future might be better than the past. But when you've watched your world collapse, when you've seen innovation and complexity lead to catastrophe, you're not inclined to innovate or add complexity. You want to stick with what works, keep things simple, avoid risks. The psychological effects of the collapse probably persisted for generations, shaping how the survivors and their descendants thought about the world and their place in it. But children are also incredibly resilient. They adapt to circumstances that would break adults. A child who grows up knowing nothing but the harsh reality of the Dark Age doesn't think of it as a catastrophe. It's just normal life. They find joy in small things, play games with whatever materials are available, form friendships, fall in love, dream about the future. The children of the collapse were victims of circumstances beyond their control, but they were also the hope for the future. They would grow up to rebuild, to innovate, to create the Iron Age civilizations that would eventually emerge from the ruins. Every civilization that rose from the ashes of the Bronze Age world was built by people who had grown up in the collapse or in its immediate aftermath. People who had known nothing but hardship, but who chose to build something better for their own children. That's pretty remarkable when you think about it. Before we go much further, make sure you've hit that subscribe button and dropped a like on this video. Seriously, it helps more than you know, and it lets me keep creating content like this that dives deep into history's most fascinating mysteries. And hey, comment below and let me know, what period of history should I cover next? What keeps you up at night wondering about the past? Now, let me take you to a region we haven't spent much time in, the Balkans. The Balkans, roughly modern Greece, Bulgaria, Albania, and surrounding areas, were peripherally connected to the Bronze Age Mediterranean world. They weren't palace economies like Mycenaean Greece or the Hittite Empire, but they were part of the trade networks. Bronze objects from the eastern Mediterranean made their way to the Balkans, and raw materials like copper and gold flowed south. During the collapse, the Balkans saw significant population movements. Groups fleeing from collapsing kingdoms in the south and east moved into the Balkans, bringing new technologies and cultural practices. At the same time, groups from the Balkans moved south, possibly as part of the Sea Peoples' migrations. The archaeological record shows upheaval, but not the same kind of total collapse we see in places like Mycenaean Greece. Some settlements were abandoned, others show destruction layers, but there's also continuity and evidence of adaptation. What's particularly interesting is that the Balkans may have been a source region for some of the iron technology that spread during and after the collapse. While the Hittites were the first to develop sophisticated ironworking, groups in the Balkans and Central Europe also started working iron around this time, possibly independently. So the Balkans were both affected by the collapse, dealing with refugees, disrupted trade networks, violence, and part of the solution, helping to spread the iron technology that would characterize the New Age. This reminds us that the Bronze Age collapse wasn't a uniform phenomenon. Different regions experienced it differently, and some regions that seemed peripheral to the Bronze Age world became more central in the Iron Age world. Let me tell you about a phenomenon called landscape of fear. When archaeologists survey regions and map out settlement patterns across time, they can see dramatic shifts in where people chose to live during the Bronze Age collapse. In the prosperous Late Bronze Age, people lived in fertile lowlands, near the coast, along major rivers, places that were good for agriculture and trade but potentially vulnerable to attack. Security wasn't the primary concern because there was enough stability that defensive position could be traded for economic advantage. But during the collapse, settlement patterns shifted dramatically. Coastal sites were abandoned. Fertile lowlands were depopulated. Instead, people moved to hilltops, to islands, to remote valleys, places that were easier to defend but harder to farm and more isolated from trade routes. This shift in settlement patterns creates what archaeologists call a landscape of fear, a geographic pattern that reveals how afraid people were. The fact that they were willing to give up fertile land and move to marginal areas shows how much they prioritized security over prosperity. And this landscape of fear persisted for generations. Even after the worst of the collapse was over, people stayed in their defensible positions. Trust had broken down so completely that communities weren't willing to move back to more vulnerable positions even when the immediate threat had passed. Some of these defensible settlements eventually became permanent. Villages that started as temporary refuges became established communities. In Greece, many of the villages that exist today were founded during or shortly after the Bronze Age collapse, when people moved to defensible hilltop positions. The landscape of fear became the landscape of survival, and eventually the landscape of recovery. Let me take you to a specific site that beautifully illustrates this. Zagora, on the island of Andros in the Aegean. Zagora was founded around 900 BCE, long after the main collapse but still in the Dark Age period. It's located on a steep promontory that juts out into the sea, with cliffs on three sides and a defensive wall across the narrow landward approach. It's an incredibly defensible position, but it's also cramped and exposed to wind and weather. Why would people choose to live in such an uncomfortable location? Because safety was more important than comfort. The people who founded Zagora were still living in a world shaped by the collapse, where security was paramount. The settlement at Zagora was small, probably no more than a few hundred people, but it shows sophisticated planning. The houses were built close together with shared walls, maximizing the use of limited space. There was a central area, possibly for community gatherings or religious rituals. The defensive wall was carefully constructed and regularly maintained. Zagora was occupied for only about 200 years, then abandoned in the early 7th century BCE. By that point, conditions had stabilized enough that people were willing to move to more comfortable locations. The landscape of fear was finally starting to fade. But for 2 centuries, Zagora represents how people lived in the aftermath of the collapse. Cautious, defensive, prioritizing security above all else, slowly rebuilding community and culture in the ruins of the Bronze Age world. Let's talk about something I find absolutely fascinating: how the collapse affected gender roles and family structures. In the Bronze Age palace economies, There was considerable gender specialization. Linear B tablets from Mycenaean palaces show women working in specialized textile production, men working in bronzeworking and agriculture, with clear role divisions. Palace women, especially in elite families, could own property, conduct business, and wield considerable economic power. There are tablets that refer to female landowners, female merchants, female religious officiaries. But when the palaces fell and society became more focused on basic survival, gender roles probably became more rigid. In subsistence farming communities, everyone works, but tasks tend to be divided along traditional gender lines with less room for specialization or individual variation. Women in Dark Age communities probably had harder lives in many ways than their Bronze Age predecessors. More physical labor, more childbearing, because infant mortality was high and families needed children to survive, less economic autonomy. The economic niches that had allowed some Bronze Age women to achieve independence were largely gone. But there's also evidence that the collapse may have created opportunities for some women. In times of crisis, when traditional social structures break down, there's more fluidity. Women might take on roles normally reserved for men if circumstances demanded it. Female leaders, female warriors, female community organizers, all become possible when the old rules no longer apply. The archaeological record doesn't tell us much about individual women from the Dark Age. They left few artifacts, no written records, no monuments. But they were there, surviving, adapting, raising the next generation, passing on cultural memory. The fact that civilization recovered at all is largely due to women. They bore and raised the children who would rebuild. They maintained households and communities when men were off fighting or had been killed. They preserved cultural traditions through storytelling, craft teaching, and religious ritual. Women have always been essential to human survival and cultural continuity, but never more so than during periods of collapse and recovery. Now let me talk about something darker: the evidence for violence during the Bronze Age collapse. Some sites show clear evidence of violent destruction. Bodies left unburied, sometimes with weapons wounds. Buildings burned with contents still inside. Hasty burials in unusual locations, suggesting people fleeing or unable to perform proper funerary rites. At some sites, like Lachish, the destruction was so intense that the mud brick walls were vitrified, turned into a kind of glass by the extreme heat. This suggests the city was thoroughly sacked and burned, probably after being captured in battle. Other sites show evidence of siege warfare. Hastily reinforced walls, stockpiles of weapons and sling stones, blocked gates, expanded fortifications. All signs that people were preparing for an attack they saw coming. And then there are the mass graves. At some sites, archaeologists have found burials containing dozens or hundreds of bodies, all buried at once without the usual care and ritual. These are probably the dead from battles or massacres, buried quickly by survivors who didn't have time or resources for individual burials. But here's what's interesting: the level of violence varies dramatically from site to site. Some places show overwhelming evidence of violent destruction. Others show no evidence of violence at all. They were simply abandoned. This suggests that the experience of the collapse was highly localized. Some communities were destroyed by invaders or raiders. Others were starved out. Others simply fled before violence reached them. Still others were hit by plague or earthquake rather than human violence. The collapse wasn't one thing happening everywhere. It was countless local catastrophes, all happening around the same time, all feeding into the larger systemic failure. And we should remember that the people inflicting violence were themselves often victims. The Sea Peoples who attacked Egyptian and Levantine cities weren't evil invaders. They were desperate refugees trying to survive. The raiders who attacked coastal settlements were often themselves fleeing from collapsed kingdoms. The violence was tragic, but it wasn't motiveless. People were doing terrible things because they saw no other option. That doesn't excuse the violence, but it helps us understand it. The Bronze Age collapse wasn't a story of good guys versus bad guys. It was a story of everyone losing, of a system failing so completely that violence became widespread because people were desperate. Let me tell you about dreams and prophecies, because these psychological phenomena played a role in how people experienced and interpreted the collapse. Ancient peoples took dreams very seriously. They believed dreams could be messages from the gods, warnings of future events, revelations of hidden truths. And during times of crisis, dream reports increase. People under stress have more vivid dreams, remember them better, and are more likely to interpret them as significant. We have texts from the late Bronze Age recording dreams and prophecies. Some of them seem to predict disaster, to warn of coming catastrophe. Of course, these texts were often written or edited after the events they predicted, so we have to be careful about taking them at face value. But they show us how people retrospectively made sense of the collapse. There's a Hittite text, for example, that describes a series of omens and prophecies warning of the empire's fall. The sun god appears in a dream and warns the king that enemies are coming and the kingdom will be destroyed. Were these prophecies real, or were they invented after the fact to explain why the empire fell? We don't know, but they show how people used prophetic narrative to make sense of catastrophe. Similarly, Egyptian texts from the collapse period include laments and prophecies describing Egypt falling into chaos, foreigners invading, the social order being overturned. Some of these may be based on real events, others are probably literary conventions. But they show that people were trying to understand and explain what was happening to their world. In times of crisis, when normal explanations fail and the world stops making sense, people turn to supernatural explanations. They look for signs, portents, divine messages. They try to find meaning in chaos. This isn't irrational. It's a very human response to overwhelming uncertainty. When you can't control or even understand what's happening, trying to discern the will of the gods at least gives you a framework for making sense of it all. And sometimes, these prophetic interpretations could become self-fulfilling. If everyone believes the gods have decreed that the kingdom will fall, morale collapses, people stop trying to defend the system, and the prophecy comes true not because the gods willed it but because belief in the prophecy undermined the will to resist. The psychology of collapse is as important as the material factors. What people believe about their situation shapes how they respond to it. Alright, let's talk about something more hopeful. The seeds of recovery that were planted even in the darkest times. During the worst of the Dark Age, when populations were at their lowest and material culture was at its crudest, there were still people innovating, experimenting, trying to build something better. The development of iron technology is the most obvious example. Iron working didn't just suddenly appear when the Hittite Empire fell and their secrets spread. It developed gradually, through countless experiments by smiths trying to work with a difficult material. Most experiments failed, but some succeeded, and successful techniques were shared and built upon. The development of alphabetic writing is another example. The Phoenicians didn't invent the alphabet from scratch. They adapted and simplified earlier writing systems, creating something that was easier to learn and more flexible than the complex scripts of the Bronze Age. Why did they do this? Probably because literacy in the Dark Age needed to be more democratic. The palace economies that had supported specialized scribal classes were gone. If writing was going to survive, it needed to be simple enough that merchants and ship captains and ordinary people could learn it. So the Phoenicians created the alphabet, and it was so successful that it spread across the Mediterranean and eventually became the basis for Greek, Latin, and all European writing systems. That's innovation born from necessity, new solutions to new problems. Similarly, new forms of political organization emerged from the collapse. The palace economies were gone, but people still needed to organize themselves, make collective decisions, defend their communities. So they experimented with different systems. In some places, strongmen emerged, warrior chiefs who led through personal charisma and martial prowess. In other places, councils of elders made decisions collectively. In still other places, religious authorities took on leadership roles. These different experiments would eventually evolve into the political systems of the Iron Age: monarchy, aristocracy, oligarchy, and eventually, in some places like Athens, democracy. The collapse destroyed the old systems, but it created space for political innovation. So even in the darkest times, even when everything seemed lost, people were building the future. They didn't know it, they were just trying to survive and solve immediate problems. but their innovations would shape the world that emerged from the ruins. That's the thing about human beings. We're remarkably creative when we have to be. Crisis forces innovation. And sometimes, the innovations that emerge from crisis are better than what existed before. Let me tell you about one final archaeological site, and then we'll start bringing this marathon session to a close. Kamos, on the southern coast of Crete. Kamos was a port town in the late Bronze Age, serving the nearby palatial center at Phaistos. It had a large civic building, probably used for trade and administration, right on the beach where ships could be pulled up. During the collapse, Kamos was destroyed, like so many other sites. But unlike most other places, Kamos was reoccupied relatively quickly, and the new occupants did something interesting. They built a temple right on top of the ruins of the old civic building. This temple wasn't dedicated to the old Minoan gods, it was apparently dedicated to new deities, possibly brought by newcomers who settled at Kamos. The architecture was different, the religious practices were different. It was a new beginning, not a restoration of the old order. Kamos in the Iron Age was never as large or as prosperous as it had been in the Bronze Age. But it survived, it functioned, it served its community. And that's what recovery looked like, not a restoration of past glory, but the creation of something new and sustainable. The temple at Kamos operated for centuries, eventually being abandoned in the Roman period. But for 1,000 years after the Bronze Age collapse, it stood as a symbol of continuity, a link between the old world and the new. When archaeologists excavated Kamos, they found offerings left at the temple spanning centuries: pottery, figurines, bronze objects, inscriptions. Each offering represents a person who came to this temple to worship, to pray, to seek divine favor. These people were living in the shadow of the collapse, in a world that had been radically transformed. But they were also building new lives, new communities, new traditions. They were the bridge between the Bronze Age and the classical world that we know so well. Their story is one of loss and adaptation, trauma and resilience, endings and new beginnings. And really, that's the story of the Bronze Age collapse in miniature. It's about how civilizations fall, yes, but it's also about how human beings survive, adapt, and eventually thrive again. Okay, we're coming up on the end of this journey, but I want to leave you with some final thoughts about what the Bronze Age collapse means for us today. The collapse happened 3,000 years ago. The people who lived through it are long dead. The civilizations that fell are never coming back. So why should we care? We should care because the Bronze Age collapse teaches us that civilization is fragile. Systems that seem stable and permanent can fall apart surprisingly quickly. Interconnection and complexity bring benefits, but they also create vulnerabilities. And when systems fail, the consequences can be catastrophic for the people who depend on those systems. We should care because we live in a world that's even more complex and interconnected than the Bronze Age Mediterranean. We depend on global supply chains for everything. We've specialized to an incredible degree. We've built systems that are efficient but not particularly resilient. If those systems failed, if some combination of climate change, pandemic disease, economic collapse, and political instability hit us all at once, we could be in serious trouble. Maybe not Bronze Age collapse level trouble, because we have advantages they didn't. But serious trouble nonetheless. The Bronze Age collapse is a warning that we shouldn't take stability for granted. We should build resilience into our systems. We should maintain redundancy even when it seems inefficient. We should preserve knowledge and skills even when they seem obsolete. We should remember that complexity creates vulnerability, and sometimes simpler, more robust systems are better than complex, optimized ones. But the Bronze Age collapse also teaches us that human beings are incredibly resilient. The survivors of the collapse lost almost everything, but they endured. They adapted. They rebuilt. They created new civilizations that, in some ways, were better than the ones that had fallen. If the worst happens, if our systems fail and our civilization collapses, our descendants will survive. They'll adapt. They'll rebuild. The future might be very different from what we imagine, but it will exist. That's both sobering and hopeful. Sobering because it means we can't count on civilization persisting in its current form. Hopeful because it means humanity will endure even if specific civilizations don't. The Bronze Age collapse is a reminder that we're part of a much longer human story than just our own lifetimes. Civilizations have risen and fallen before. They'll rise and fall again. But human beings persist, adapt, and create new possibilities from the ruins of the old. And ultimately, that's what this whole long story has been about. The resilience of the human spirit, the ability to survive catastrophe and build something new, the refusal to give up even when everything seems lost. The scribes of Mycenaean Greece wrote their last tablets and fled into the darkness. But their descendants eventually learned to write again, created the Greek alphabet, and produced some of the greatest literature in human history. The bronzesmiths watched their craft become obsolete as tin supplies dried up. But some of them learned to work iron, and their iron tools helped build the civilizations of the Iron Age. The merchants saw their trade networks collapse and the seas become too dangerous to sail. But some of them kept sailing anyway, on a smaller scale, maintaining some connection between communities even in the darkest times. And eventually, trade recovered and the Mediterranean became a highway of commerce again. The farmers watched their children starve and their fields turn to dust. But they kept planting, kept hoping, kept struggling to survive. And their descendants eventually prospered again. The storytellers watched their entire world fall apart. But they kept telling stories, kept preserving memories, kept insisting that the past mattered. And those stories eventually became the myths and legends that shaped later civilizations. Everyone lost something in the Bronze Age collapse. Many lost everything, including their lives. But the story didn't end. Life continued. Recovery happened. New civilizations emerged. And that's the final lesson of the Bronze Age collapse. Endings are real, loss is real, catastrophe is real. But so is resilience. So is adaptation. So is the human capacity to survive, to rebuild, to create something new from the ruins of the old. The Bronze Age is gone, but we remember. And in remembering, we honor those who survived, we learn from those who fell, and we prepare ourselves for whatever challenges the future might bring. Thank you for joining me on this incredibly long journey through one of the darkest and most fascinating periods in human history. If you made it this far, you're a real one. Hit that subscribe button, drop a comment, let me know what you thought. And check out my other videos for more deep dives into history's greatest mysteries. The past is gone, but never forgotten. The future is uncertain, but full of possibility. And we're all part of the ongoing human story, the long arc from the Bronze Age to today and beyond. Sleep well, dream deep, and remember, civilizations rise and fall, but humanity endures. This has been Dreamless Timelines. Until next time, keep exploring, keep learning, and keep the stories alive. Good night.